Murder's a Witch by Danielle Garrett. Narrated by Amanda Ronconi. Chapter 1. In other news, the Seattle Haven is reporting a shortage of nightshade following an ongoing string of thefts. The Jewel Box Apothecary, the area's main supplier, reported another robbery over the weekend. In an effort to restock quickly, the proprietor, Agnes Barth, is offering double the standard price for anyone with nightshade for sale. "We could make a mint," I said, turning away from the TV screen to consult my orange tabby cat, Boots, who was perched on the bedside table to my right. I sighed. "It's too bad we're banished, huh?" Boots yawned. "Yes, I know. Witch problems, not cat problems." I swung my legs off the bed, stood up, and stretched my arms over my head as the nightly news reporter for the Witch Wire moved on to celebrity news. She was fangirling all over Petra, the hottest new pop star, who, as it turned out, was also a witch. The entire country was captivated by her, although I suspected that had more to do with her magically enhanced assets than her singing prowess. Regardless, she was making a splash in both the human and supernatural worlds. I, however, was not interested. I waved a hand at the cabinet opposite my four-poster bed, and the TV silenced. The birch doors slid shut to conceal the device. According to the clock that was squished between Boots' furry rear end and the lamp, it was nearly midnight. I had to be up for work in less than 5 hours. I scratched Boots' head, and he opened his shimmering amber eyes. "What do you think, Boots? Time to—" I stopped mid-sentence and cocked an ear toward a sudden sound outside my bedroom window that overlooked a carefully cultivated rose garden. A scratching sound, followed by 2 thumps. What in the other world? Howling winds, scraping branches, and even occasional thunderstorms were not an uncommon occurrence at the Beechwood Manor. The 120-year-old house sat atop a bluff overlooking the Pacific Ocean, and typically suffered damage each year from windstorms and other forces of nature. Normally, I wasn't fazed by the weather. As an elemental witch, I was in tune with nature, and found that extreme weather only enhanced my magic. In fact, some of my favorite potion recipes had been born in the middle of a nice howler. The only time I bemoaned a good storm was if the rain threatened a beloved pair of suede heels. It hadn't been particularly windy earlier, when I'd been out for an evening walk around town, but things changed quickly on the coast. But those thumps? Those were definitely new. A muted thump sounded beside me as Boots jumped to the floor, tail twitching. As my familiar, he fancied himself something of a guard cat and had obviously heard the disturbance outside the window, too. "Boots!" I hissed, but all I saw was a tawny-colored rear end snaking through the bedroom door and out into the hallway. Boom! I jumped as another loud crash sounded outside my window. Who would be out in the flower beds at this time of night? Or even worse, what? I fisted my hands together and marched out the door, following the trail Boots had just taken. The Beechwood Manor was a historic mansion turned B&B, then converted to a safe house for displaced supernaturals, like myself. Currently, I was sharing the house with a saucy vampiress named Lacey Vaughn, a shifter named Adam St. James, and a newcomer named Gary, whom I hadn't quite puzzled out yet. Of my 3 housemates, I had a good idea who was most likely the culprit behind the midnight hullabaloo. Adam St. James. Despite his name, there was nothing saintly about the man. He was charming, clever, and absurdly good-looking. The problem was that he knew it. Lost in thought, I didn't see Boots in the dimly lit hallway until I nearly tripped over him. He growled at the impact, but then began to weave around my ankles, rubbing his head against my legs. I conjured a small orb of light to guide us the rest of the way. "Sorry, Bootsy." He peered up at me and blinked once, looking pointedly at my legs. I groaned as I realized I was about to go outside wearing my hot pink pajama pants with cartoon pineapples splashed across them. Oh, Adam was going to have a field day when he saw them. "Come on," I muttered, as the 20-pound cat continued to circle my legs. With the tip of my slipper, I nudged him out of the way and made a beeline for the front doors of the manor. If Adam was out there causing a ruckus, I had to stop him before someone in the neighborhood got suspicious. The last thing I needed was the cops showing up, nosing around and asking a bunch of questions. The crisp night air bit into the exposed skin on my arms, raising goosebumps as soon as I stepped onto the wraparound porch. I tugged lightly on the doorknob, and the front door closed behind me without a sound. With boots still on my heels, I crept quietly around the side of the house to where my windows were located, and stopped a few paces away from the source of the noise. Peering into the night, I realized that I was wrong. It wasn't Adam poking around the flower beds. I froze, and quickly extinguished the magic orb of light in my hand. The moon was nearly full, and provided enough light for me to see that a man, dressed from head to toe in black, was creeping away from my windows and heading around to the back of the house. He had a flashlight in one hand and was shining it at the foundation of the house. My fingers itched, and a warm pulse of magic flowed into the palm of my hand, ready if I needed to fire off a stunning spell. "Stop!" I called out into the night between us. "I have a weapon." Boots meowed loudly to emphasize my threat. I rolled my eyes. Perfect, very threatening. An overweight house cat for backup. The man turned around and raised his hands, the beam of his flashlight shooting up into the sky. He sounded slightly panicked as he responded, Hey, look, I'm unarmed." "Who are you?" I demanded as I folded my arms, magic still at the ready should I need it. His gaze darted up and down me, and then a sour frown appeared on his lips. "I thought you said you were armed." I shrugged. "Does it matter? Who are you, and why are you sneaking around my house?" The man eyed me and Boots with a smirk. "I just think one should always be honest." I snorted. Was this guy for real? I cocked my hip and glared at him. "Says the creep sneaking around my backyard at midnight." The man surprised me by chuckling softly. With his hands still in the air, he replied, "All right, fair point. I'm gonna drop my hands now. Promise you won't sick your tabby on me?" I glanced down at Boots. "What do you think?" He mewed and rolled over in the soft dirt. "Happy?" I asked, cutting my glance back to the intruder. "I'm pretty sure he's not going to attack." He must have been appeased because he pocketed his hands and took a few steps closer to us. The pulse of magic in my hand warmed. With a single flick of my fingers, I could stop him in his tracks. "Not yet, Holly." When he was within a few feet of me, I held out my other hand. "That's close enough," I warned him. "Now tell me who you are, or I'm going to go call the police and tell them there's some kind of peeping Tom in the neighborhood." He scratched his chin, and a glint of amusement lit his eyes. "That expression always makes me feel bad for guys named Tom." I wasn't amused. "Who are you?" I spat between gritted teeth. The fatigue from my long day was kicking in. I wanted to get back inside to my warm bed and the sweet comfort of sleep. "Easy there, Peaches. My name is Nick Rivers. Here." He reached carefully into his pocket to pull out a card and handed it to me. Nicholas G. Rivers, private investigator. "You're a PI." I flipped the card over and ran my finger over the embossed graphic of his initials inside a geometric prism. My heart slammed into my chest, but I did my best to suppress the bubbling panic. "Who are you investigating?" Certainly the agency hadn't sent someone to check up on me. Had they? Was Nick a supernatural? He definitely didn't look like one. He looked more like an accountant. Although, to be fair, I have heard that some accountants basically have magical powers. Nick clucked his tongue. It's my turn to ask a question. What's your name?" I raised an eyebrow. Was it a trick question? Why was he prowling outside my window in the middle of the night if he wasn't investigating me? Was he looking into someone else at the manor? It did host a smorgasbord of interesting characters, to say the least. "I'm Holly Bolt," I said, not willing to give up any further information until I knew his agenda. "Nice to meet you, Holly." Nick stepped closer, ignoring my previous warning, and reached out a hand for a friendly introduction. I ignored him, leaving his hand hanging between us. "What are you doing here, Mr. Rivers?" Stubbornly refusing to retract his hand, he gave me another once-over. "Come on, Holly. We can be civilized here, can't we?" "Once you tell me what you're doing, sure. We'll be great pals. I always like to affiliate myself with backyard snoops." He chuckled and pocketed his hand. "You're a tough cookie, Holly. I'm not investigating anyone in particular. On the weekends, I like to take tour groups out to do paranormal hunts." "Hunts?" Oh, this was so not good. He smiled. "Yeah, you know, go out to supposedly haunted places, tell ghost stories, give people a good scare, that kind of thing." I forced a laugh. "And you think the Beechwood Manor is haunted?" He shrugged. "I don't know. Is it?" "Obviously not," I fired back, shaking my head in disbelief and hoping my act wasn't as transparent as it felt. Well, I think it fits the bill." He grinned. "I don't follow." "I saw this place posted on a directory of suspected haunts and decided I wanted to see it in person." "There's a directory of haunted houses?" Nick grinned. "Yes, ma'am." Huh. Learn something new every day. "Anyway, I'm new to the area, working a case, and decided to check out the house for myself firsthand. Turns out it's even better than I imagined. It checks all the boxes." He held up his fingers and ran through the selling points. "It's old, it has a lot of history, and the biggest thing is that people have died here, which means there are guaranteed to be some creepy stories to tell. Did you know that?" I nodded, setting my mouth in a thin line. "I've heard the stories. But you're forgetting one thing, Mr. Rivers." "Nick," he corrected. "And what am I missing?" "There are people living here. The Beechwood Manor isn't some abandoned house for you and whomever you can dupe into taking your tour to go trampling around in." "Right, I get that. Obviously, I was planning to come back during the day to introduce myself and give a formal pitch. You just beat me to the punch." I arched a brow. "You weren't exactly quiet." Nick chuckled. "Apologies. So tell me, Holly, do you own the home?" "It's a rental," I said, my words clipped. My patience was tissue paper thin. One more snarky smile from Nick and he was going to get blasted halfway to the Canadian border. "I see. And how long have you been living here, if I may?" "You may not." I felt boots bump against my legs. He could sense my rising energy levels. "In any case, no one that lives here will allow you and your tour to parade through, so I suggest you run along to the next stop in your hunt. None of us here appreciate strange salesmen showing up with something to pitch, especially not nosy ones who trespass in the middle of the night looking like a stuntman from a spy movie." I jerked my chin at his all-black attire, which included a thick beanie. Unruly dark hair poked splayed across his forehead under the hem of the hat. Although, considering my neon pajama ensemble, I wasn't in much of a position to play fashion police. Before Nick could argue his case further, I turned away, releasing the magic as my hand brushed against the soft cotton of my pajama bottoms. "If you change your mind, give me a call. My number's on the card. I'd cut you in on the admissions sales." I sighed impatiently. "Goodbye, Mr. Rivers." Moments later, a pair of boots crunched down the gravel walk, and when I stopped to look back, he was stalking down the short driveway that led away from the old servants' entrance on the side of the house. Good riddance. I wasn't sure which part of the encounter was more insulting, That he had the nerve to skulk around in our bushes in the middle of the night? Or that he made a profit off of spreading what were no doubt lies and embellished tales about supernaturals? I waited until I saw a pair of headlights illuminate the elegant circular drive leading to the manor before I relaxed marginally. There were 3 other houses across the street, all built within the last 20 years, but they were far enough away that the manor still had a private feel, despite being less than a block away from a cul-de-sac offshoot of the largest subdivision in Beechwood Harbor. I watched from the shadows of the flower beds as his sleek car turned around and sped off into the night. With a shake of my shoulders, I released the pent-up anxiety bunched in between my muscles. He might be gone for now, but I had a sinking feeling in my gut that told me Nick Rivers wasn't the type to give up that easily. With a heavy sigh that was a mixture of exhaustion and relief, I went back inside the manor, shut and bolted the door behind me, and stooped over to pick up boots. I groaned at the effort of sweeping the 20-pound beast off the floor as I tucked him under my arm. "Okay, Bootsy, now we're officially going to bed." He purred his agreement.
"A little late for you, isn't it?"
I jolted at the voice, and saw Posy, the 4th and somewhat unofficial roommate at the manor.
"Oh,
hello, Posy."
"Are you just getting in?"
Her tone was casual, but her expression was stern. Deep lines furrowed her mouth and gathered between her brows. Her dark hair was piled on top of her head, wound up just as tightly as she was. Deep down, sometimes really deep, she was a sweet lady. But she had a penchant for nosiness that made it hard not to roll my eyes any time she entered a room. I offered a simple smile. "No, I thought I heard something outside, but it was just the bushes rustling around. Looks like we're in for a storm." The stern look disappeared as a gleeful giggle broke through her stony exterior.
"Oh, goody. I do love a howler."
I nodded politely and hefted Boots against my hip for extra support as I carted him down the hall towards my room. "Good night, Posy." When I stopped at my door, I glanced over just in time to watch Posy's silvery silhouette fade through the wall.
"Good night, Holly."
Chapter 2. "For the last time, Greta, this is my section of the sidewalk." I suppressed a grin as I stepped around the 2 angry-looking women. My boss, Peg Holloway, owned Siren's Song, the best coffee house in town. Greta McCoy owned the gardening supply shop next door. They paused just long enough to politely nod at me as I crossed in front of them and swung into the coffee shop. Their loud bickering resumed before the door even swung shut behind me. "I'll be right there," a small voice called out to me from somewhere in the back. "It's just me, Cass." Cassie Pearson, my coworker and closest friend in Beechwood Harbor, popped away from whatever she'd been busy with in the back and flashed me a smile. "Oh, thank goodness." I took my place behind the counter and retrieved my apron from one of the 3 brass hooks on the wall. "How long has that been going on?" I asked, thumbing over my shoulder to the scene on the front walk. Cassie sighed and leaned over the counter. Her thick, wavy brown hair was pulled back in a French braid that fell over her shoulder as she peeked around the vintage cash register and glanced out the large picture windows that graced the front of the shop. "They're still going at it?" She huffed and rolled her crystal blue eyes. I grinned. Pretty passionately from the clip I heard. I pulled my own long auburn hair back into a ponytail. "What's the hot-button issue of the day? Parking snafu? Oh, wait, no, I know. It has something to do with our playlist." Cassie giggled and ducked back out of sight when Peg began flailing her arms and gesturing wildly to emphasize whatever point she was trying to make. "No, it's much more petty than that." "Is that even possible?" I secured my elastic hairband, straightened my apron, and started toward the espresso machine to make my first cup of coffee. Judging by the way the shift was starting, I decided to make it a triple shot. Peg and Greta often reminded me of those rams that live up in the mountains. Every so often they bash their horns together to try to establish dominance. There was always some kind of storm brewing between the 2 middle-aged women. From what I'd gathered, their rivalry was rooted in their teen years. They'd been classmates in school and had competed for everything. Homecoming queen, trophies on the track team, and the attention of the captain of the football team. How they'd come to own businesses right next door to one another was beyond me. I'd never asked for that particular piece of the backstory. However it had happened, the close proximity was an evergreen source of trouble. "Apparently so," Cassie answered, coming to stand beside me as I pulled my first 2 shots of espresso. "Peg is all up in arms because Greta hung planter baskets all along the sidewalk." I waited a beat for the rest of the story to unfold. "And?" "That's it," Cassie replied. "Peg says they're not hung at the right height, and she's convinced that someone will knock their noggin, to borrow her phrase." I burst into a peal of laughter that ricocheted through the quiet shop. "Wow." "Yeah. You missed the part where she busted out a measuring tape. Oh, and she called Greta fun-sized." I winced. She didn't. Cassie propped her elbows on the counter and gave me a sidelong glance. "She sure did. So I wouldn't expect this battle to blow over for at least another hour. It's a shame we don't have popcorn." I laughed, even as I shook my head at the absurdity of it all. 2 grown women fighting about hanging baskets. Granted, Peg did have several inches over Greta, but neither of them are petite women. The way I saw it, they just made up stuff to annoy each other. It was like a sport to them. I poured the shots into my favorite stainless steel tumbler, the one with a turquoise background and a silver emblem for the Magic Beans Coffee House on the front. Non-supernaturals would vaguely recognize it as a popular cafe in the Seattle area, but it was actually something much more. It was the gateway to the Seattle Haven. In the supernatural world, havens were protected communities where supers could live without worrying about concealing their powers or species from humans. They were able to live and work inside the community itself, but also had the freedom to go out into the human world if they chose. Which is why all of the havens reside in large cities. It was easier to conceal a secret society in all the hustle and bustle and noise. The gate to the Seattle Haven was located in the back of the downtown coffee shop. The Haven had been my home up until 6 months ago when an unfortunate set of circumstances had led to my banishment. In any case, the mug was still my favorite. I was still laughing over Peg and Greta's ridiculous feud as I steamed a pitcher of milk. When a nice layer of foam formed on top, I shut off the steam and poured the milk into my tumbler. I grinned over at Cassie. "I'll be sure to avoid the next town hall assembly. I'm sure there will be a proposed addendum to the legislation regarding hanging botanicals." "No kidding." Cassie smiled as she turned away to fuss with a sheet of cookies in the front case. While she had her back turned, I swirled my fingers over the foam in my tumbler and created a perfect fleur-de-lis in the froth. I hadn't mastered the practice of pouring perfect latte art, but with a little magical assistance, I was a downright prodigy. Cassie turned back around as I was sliding the lid over the top and caught a peek at the design. She stilled my hand to take a closer look, and then shook her head, her blue eyes alive with wonder. "That's beautiful. Sheesh, I really need to watch you do that one of these days," she said with a wistful sigh. "You're so talented, Holly." I smiled at the pretty pattern. Latte art wasn't an official part of my job, but it was something that I added here and there, just because it made me happy. As a witch living in a human community, I had precious few opportunities to use my magic. That was new for me. I'd been raised in the Haven network, and spent the first 22 years of my life being able to wield it and show off as much as I wanted without worrying what anyone thought or fearing that I would be reported. Well, until I was. Following a particularly nasty incident in the San Francisco Haven, my childhood home, I was forced to relocate for the first time. After that, I bounced between a few Southern California havens, but none of those situations panned out to be the long-term home I was looking for. I decided to make a bigger move to put distance between myself and my not-so-flattering reputation. I ended up going north and spent 3 years living in the Seattle Haven. However, it didn't take long before that turned out to be a bust, too. and at 28 years old, I was exiled from the Haven system and forced to live on my own, outside of the protection and freedom that a Haven had to offer. It had been 6 months since my arrival in Beechwood Harbor, and thus far I'd managed to fly under the radar. But it wasn't easy to keep my true identity a secret from virtually everyone around me. The only place I was allowed to be myself to the fullest degree was inside the confines of the Beechwood Manor. Everyone in residence was a supernatural, and was bound to secrecy by strong charms that had been carefully woven into the foundation of the home itself. They were unbreakable and binding to all those who passed through. The front door of the shop slammed open, and the stillness of the shop was shattered by an angry roar.
The nerve of that woman!
Cassie and I sprang apart as Peg stormed through the front door. I snapped the lid onto my tumbler, set it on the counter beside the espresso machine, and picked up a cloth to wipe off the steamer wand before the milk dried. Peg continued ranting to herself as she stalked through the shop. Her hands twitched with agitated gestures as she took each step.
Those things are a death trap. And guess who'll get sued when some tourist waddles down the walk and gets taken out by a basket of petunias?
Cassie opened her mouth to answer, but I caught her eye first and shook my head.
She's just out of her mind.
Peg stomped around the large case containing pastries and breakfast items and gave both of us a cold stare.
What are you two doing? Don't just stand there. The water pitchers are low, the floor needs to be swept, and the order in back still needs to be checked in.
I started unpacking the order, Peg. Cassie hurried to reply.
Started?
Peg narrowed her eyes. I'll go finish the order. Cassie jumped into action, panic evident in her voice as she scurried down the short hallway that led to the back room. Peg's head rotated and her harsh stare fell on me. I held up a finger. I'll sweep and get the water pitchers. Still snarling, Peg whipped around the corner and stormed into the back. Seconds later, the door to her small office slammed shut. I set the steamer wand rag aside, took a deep drink of my latte, and went to the long table under the front windows. It was crafted from driftwood gathered from the beach. A local woodworker had fashioned the pieces into a gorgeous table that showcased the natural beauty of the different types of wood, and had gifted it to Peg when she opened the shop. It served as a condiment bar that held coffee essentials. 2 tall pitchers of ice water were flanked by a tower of clear plastic cups on one side, and a caddy containing lids, straws, half a dozen sweetener options, and cardboard cup cozies on the other. I sighed when I saw that the water pitchers in question were barely a quarter of the way emptied. Yes, clearly this was an emergency. Batwings and toadstools, I muttered to myself, grabbing the pitchers. What is she expecting? A herd of camels for lunch? Before I could haul them behind the counter to top them off with filtered water, a soft tinkling sounded as the front door opened. I turned around to greet my first customer of the day. Good morning, Mr. Hooper, I said, smiling brightly as Jasper Hooper, an elderly man with a sunny disposition and gentle spirit, ambled into the shop. He was a local and came into the shop every morning at the same time like clockwork. Most of Siren Song's customers were regulars, and aside from a small pocket of customers that grated on my nerves to the point that I wanted to hex them, most of them were wonderful, and great tippers to boot. There was a handful of regulars that were particularly endearing. Jasper Hooper was at the top of that list. As a bonus, he was also a supernatural, a wizard, though he claimed to be retired from all that. Jasper smiled.
Morning, Holly. A lovely day, don't you think?
Truthfully, that depended on how many hours Peg spent locked away in her office versus micromanaging Cassie and me all shift. I smiled sweetly. It's going to be a great day. What time are the grandbabies getting into town? Jasper lit up like Yuletide morning.
10 o'clock.
I glanced at the large copper-plated clock hanging on the wall above a set of French doors that led to the patio. It was creeping up to 10. Well, you better take your order to go, then, I said, throwing him a wink.
I suppose so.
Jasper glanced around behind him. There were a couple of patrons in the shop, but they appeared to be engrossed in whatever was on their computer screens. They had their earbuds in, blocking out the rest of us. He came closer to the counter and leaned against it, a hand absently going to his lower back.
"Do you have the potion?"
he whispered. I craned around to look over my own shoulder. After verifying that we weren't being watched, I pulled a small vial, corked with a stopper, from the front pocket of my jeans. The contents were seafoam green and nearly opaque. Jasper grinned from ear to ear at the sight of the bottle and reached for his wallet.
"Just a short coffee today, Holly."
I gave him a nod and turned away to pour a small cup of coffee from the freshly brewed carafe on the counter behind me. Before sliding the lid on the cup, I uncorked the vial, dumped the contents into the coffee, and then handed it to Jasper.
"What do I owe you?"
he asked, looking down at the contents of his old faded wallet. Jasper came in every morning for a hot cup of coffee, and 2 or 3 times a week he ordered it with a little extra oomph, courtesy of one of my handcrafted potions. He usually requested it for the days that his grandchildren would be visiting. A small dose of my specialty blend, Perky Potion, was enough to chase away his chronic lower back pain and get him through a day of pillow forts, frisbee chasing, and tickle monster games with his young grandchildren. $3.50, I replied, my tone neutral. Jasper passed over the money for the coffee and then dropped 2 golden coins into my hand.
"Thanks, Holly. You're a lifesaver."
I grinned. "Don't thank me. Thank the magic of the beans," I replied, flashing him a wink. Lima beans were the star ingredient in the Perky Potion, though anyone overhearing us would assume I meant the coffee beans. Jasper returned the sly wink.
"I'll be back tomorrow."
"I hope you have a lovely day with your grandbabies," I said, smiling.
"Thank you."
He nodded and took a deep sip from the coffee in his hand. The potion worked best when first mixed with coffee. The caffeine boosted the potency of the spell, and while it took about 10 minutes to fully kick in, the effects would last all day. The bell on the front door chimed again, and I leaned around Jasper to offer a friendly smile to the new customer. It disappeared as soon as I found myself staring at a familiar face, sporting a gleaming, arrogant smile. Nick Rivers, private investigator, and professional pain in the tush. Chapter 3. "What are you doing here?" I asked, not bothering to conceal the acidity in my tone as Nick smirked and approached the counter. He quirked his lips and made a tisking sound under his breath. "Now, is that any way to greet a paying customer?" I tossed a glance over my shoulder to make sure Peg wasn't lurking nearby. The last thing I needed was for her to overhear a customer complaint, especially when she was already on a tear. The hallway was empty, so I turned my glare back to Nick. "What do you want, Mr. Rivers?" He drummed his fingers on the countertop and perused the menu, giving me an extra minute to stew. "A large mocha. For starters." I clenched my jaw and marched to the espresso machine. I ignored Nick and refused to make eye contact as I went through the process of making his drink at double speed. When the last dollop of whipped cream was in place, I slapped my palm on the bottom of the sprinkle container with deliberate force. Bop, bop. I placed the drink on the counter in front of him. $4.50. "Thank you. Just what I needed," Nick said, passing over a $5 bill. I snatched the bill from his hand with a slight snap. "Right. It would be a tragedy if you were to run out of energy before you could continue your peeping spree through the neighborhood." For the first time, he showed a glimmer of irritation. "Come on, Holly. Why can't we be friends?" Let me see." I tapped my finger against my lips, mocking deep thought. "It's probably because the only thing that I really know about you is that you're a nosy PI who's not opposed to prowling around in strangers' bushes in the middle of the night. Oh, and when I gave you the boot, you tried to talk me into selling out the privacy of my roommates. What can I say? It's all left a bad taste in my mouth, so excuse me for not wanting to chit-chat with you." Nick took the coffee cup and lifted it to his lips, his ocean blue eyes still locked on mine as though he were attempting to read my mind. In the light of day, I could see that he was probably around my age, maybe a little older. His skin held a deep tan, and subtle lines from the sun creased the edges of his eyes. He was a few inches taller than me, with a lanky frame, and his long-sleeved shirt was snug enough to show off his sculpted arms. It was clear that he kept in shape, but was still far from being a bodybuilder gym rat. He wasn't wearing a hat today, and his dark hair was spiked up in the front, likely with the help of some kind of styling product. His jaw sported stubble. Apparently, the poor thing hadn't had a chance to shave after a night spent on a paranormal stakeout. I dropped my gaze to the cash register and fussed with the sticky buttons to tabulate the sale and put away the cash. I held out his change, resisting the urge to give it to him in pennies. "Have a nice day, Mr. Rivers." He took the change and immediately deposited it into the tip jar off to the side of the register, with an added bill for good measure. His eyes whizzed back to mine, and he leaned forward. "Holly,
Phew! That was a close one."
I jolted at the sound of Cassie's voice, and whipped around as she strode back to the counter. She held a clipboard in her hands and was consulting it as she walked back to the register. She glanced up and stopped abruptly at the sight of Nick.
"Oh, sorry, Holly. I didn't know you were with a customer."
She offered Nick a shy smile and tucked away a strand of hair that had fallen out of her loose braid. She pushed it behind her ear and ducked her chin. Oh, brother. Sure, Nick Rivers was a good-looking man. I wasn't going to try and argue that point. Handsome or not, I wasn't interested in Nick or anyone else. When I moved to Beechwood Harbor, I took myself off the dating market. Much to Adam St. James's chagrin, I needed to get my life together and finally settle down someplace before I tangled my life together with someone else's. And when that day came, it would be with another supernatural. Otherwise, things got too messy. People always wanted to try the Romeo and Juliet approach, a supernatural and a human. It usually ended about as well as the tragic tale. No, thank you. Cassie was grinning like she swallowed a gallon of love potion.
"Are you visiting Beechwood?"
she asked, practically batting her lashes. Nick smiled. "I just moved here, actually."
"Oh, well, in that case, welcome."
She reached out her hand.
"I'm Cassandra, but everyone calls me Cassie."
"Nicholas Rivers," Nick replied. He flashed a pointed look at me. "People usually call me Nick."
"It's nice to meet you, Nick. Where are you from originally?"
Cassie and her younger sister, Kira, were born and raised in Beechwood Harbor. They thrived in the small-town life and were incredibly warm and welcoming to newcomers. It was part of the reason that Cassie and I had become such fast friends, even though she wasn't a supernatural and had no idea that I was a witch. She had been assigned to train me as a barista when I got the job at Siren Song, and we bonded over those first few weeks. After everything that happened in Seattle and the other havens, I was nervous about adjusting to life in a non-magical community. After meeting Cassie, I relaxed and decided that maybe it would be a change for the better. For that, I would always be grateful to her. Thinking back to my own arrival in Beechwood Harbor, I couldn't fault Cassie for being so sweet to Nick. It was just her nature, and something that I appreciated about her, despite her hospitality's current beneficiary. "You live here?" I interjected, thinking back to our conversation in the bushes. Hadn't he said he'd come into town on a case and decided to check out the Beechwood Manor since he was nearby? He hadn't said anything about living here. "Yes. As I said, I recently relocated," Nick said, his tone butter smooth. "From the LA area, actually." Cassie shot me a strange look, confused by my sharp tone, and then turned her smile back to Nick. She leaned over the counter toward him.
"That sounds exciting. I've never been to California."
A cold shiver snaked up my spine. Years had passed since the last time I was in Los Angeles, but still, something about it didn't sit right. Nick was a long way from home, and I wanted to know why. Last night, he told me he was in the area working a case. Judging from the fact that we first met in my front yard, and then less than 12 hours later he was at my place of employment, I couldn't help but wonder if I was the target of this mystery case. Nick kept his gaze on Cassie. You should go someday. I already miss the sunshine. Cassie laughed, the sound light and bubbly.
You'll get used to the weather here, I promise. Summer is right around the corner, and we'll have some of that sunshine for ourselves.
Nick grinned at her. That's good to hear.
If you need to know where anything is, just stop in or give us a call.
Cassie reached over to pick up a business card for the shop from a stack on the counter in front of the register. She handed it to Nick and smiled.
See? It's a magnet, so you can slap it right on your fridge.
Clever, he said, inspecting the glossy magnet. Thank you, Cassie. It was very nice to meet you. Caffeine is my lifeblood, so I'm sure we'll be seeing each other quite often. Nick flashed a smile at me. Ollie? Always a pleasure. He lifted his paper cup like he was making a silent toast before he turned and left the small shop. He turned and tossed us another wave as he passed by the last of the large windows along the front wall and disappeared from sight. Cassie waited a full beat before she lunged at me and grabbed my arm excitedly.
Finally! How long have I been begging for some decent-looking guys to move into town?
Hey! Lionel Murray, one of our regulars, took umbrage from his corner table. I'm right here, Cassie. Anytime you need a handsome man to take you out. She gave a nervous little laugh.
Right, Mr. Murray.
She twitched her fingers in his direction, and he flashed a smile before hunching back over his keyboard. He was at least 20 years older than Cassie and usually smelled like cigar smoke. As soon as he was occupied again, she winced and then lolled her head, her tongue sticking out like a dead fish. Well, if fish had tongues, anyway. I shuddered at the strange thought. Well, he's all yours, Cass. Cassie folded her arms.
Yeah, I noticed you were a little frosty. What was that all about?
I paused, wondering if I should tell her about my original meeting with Nick, but quickly decided against it. If she was truly interested in him, who was I to spoil it for her? Then again, I was close friends with Cassie, which meant that if she and Nick hit it off, I'd be stuck dealing with him a lot more. I already had a feeling our interactions were going to be too frequent. I forced my mind to stop wandering down rabbit trails and smiled at my friend. I didn't mean to be. He's just not my type. I'm sure he's great. Cassie grinned and peeked over at me from the corner of her eye as she rearranged the trays in the case. She worked quickly, consolidating pastries and organizing what was left after the morning rush.
You've got Adam anyway.
What? A surprised laugh burst from my lips. No, that's so not true. Cassie grinned and closed the case back up.
Sure, keep denying it. He lives, 5 feet from you? There's no way you can be that close to someone so delish and not notice.
If only she knew the truth. Adam St. James was a shifter, and if I'd sworn off relationships with non-supers, then I'd doubly sworn off shifters. Nothing but trouble, and not the fun kind. Oh, I'm not saying I haven't noticed him. Adam is not the kind of guy to go unnoticed. I laughed and shook my head, thinking about the wannabe Casanova. But trust me, we're just friends.
Right.
Cassie giggled and rounded the counter to go wipe down the tables. I smiled as she gave Mr. Murray's table a wide berth.
All I'm saying is that if Adam ever looked at me the way he looked at you, I would have a really hard time turning him down.
I rolled my eyes. That was Adam. I'm happy just being a crazy cat lady, I said, smiling across the room at Cassie. I leaned against the back counter and picked up my now cold latte. Boots is the only man I need in my life right now. Cassie let loose a peal of laughter and shook her head.
That's just sad.
I grinned. What can I say? He gets me. Chapter 4. It was my short day at Siren Song, so after I put in my 4 hours, I left Cassie and Frankie to close up and headed back home. I barely made it 3 steps inside the expansive foyer of the old home before I was greeted by Posy, her face pale. Well, more than normal, anyway. A roar of shouting ricocheted down the hall from the direction of the kitchen. I scrubbed a hand down my face. Peg had remained in a grumpy mood all day and had chased Cassie and me around the small shop mercilessly, barking at us like an obnoxious ankle-biting dog. I peeked out at Posey through my fingers. Do I even want to know?
Probably not. But you need to fix it before they tear each other apart. They won't listen to me.
Her expression resembled a librarian who just caught someone putting a book away in the wrong place. I glanced down the hall on the other side of the grand staircase and stared longingly at the door to my room. If I bolted, I could lock myself inside before anyone else realized I was home. Posey glowered at me.
They're one step away from getting booted. I can't take this stress.
I huffed. I didn't need to ask who they were. She was referring to Adam and Lacey Vaughn, our vampiress/pageant queen. I grimaced before I asked my next question. He didn't ask her out again, did he? She shook her head.
Worse.
Worse? My eyebrows shot up my forehead. What could he have... I stopped. He didn't. Posey nodded.
He did.
He's such an idiot, I groaned, and balled my hands tight against the rush of magic that threatened to spill out. Posey shrugged her translucent shoulder.
No arguments from me. Back in my day, shifters lived in their own communes. Not by their own choice, mind you. Now, thanks to the council, they just run amok.
Posey glided up toward the ceiling, giving me one last angry librarian look.
I'm going to rest. Fix it, Holly.
Before I could object, she shimmered out of sight. She spent most of her time at the Beechwood Manor, and while she no longer had a room, she mostly occupied the attic. It served as her sanctuary away from the rest of us. I'd been up there once, and found it was littered wall to wall with old trunks and boxes. I had no idea what they contained, but Adam had ordered me not to go rifling through them when I first moved in. He'd been living at the manor for a few years and knew all the rules. Not that it kept him from breaking them on a semi-regular basis. Whatever was in the attic, it soothed Posey's ghostly anxieties and kept her energy balanced. If I were a betting witch, I would guess that there wasn't anything special in the attic that calmed her. It was just the absence of the insanity that spilled out all over the rest of the house. No rest for the witches, huh? I muttered to myself as I stalked to my room, opened the door, and let Boots out. Hey, pal, you want to come sharpen your claws on a couple of troublemakers? Boots rammed his head against my leg, and then went to weaving in and around my feet as I slipped out of my black knit sweater. I tossed the garment onto my bed before closing the door again. Well, come on then, I said to the orange butterball with legs. Truthfully, he'd be no match for a vampire or a shifter, especially not Adam's beast form, a huge black dog that was closer in size to a grizzly bear than a Labrador, but it helped to have Boots at my feet. I walked down the hallway and stopped short, my hand resting on the swinging door that led into the kitchen. Fleabag? Fanger? Oh, good. The mature phase of the argument had clearly begun. I pushed into the room, balled my hands, and planted them on my hips. My glare cut to Adam first, and then to Lacey. They were squared off against each other, one on either side of the L-shaped counter. At my entrance, they both stopped shooting daggers at each other and turned them in my direction. Are you trying to get us all evicted? I growled. Adam folded his arms across his broad chest and gave me a slow grin. Don't worry, gorgeous. If we get evicted, I'll take care of you. I rolled my eyes. Adam, don't start. Adam flirted as naturally as most people breathed. It was embedded in his DNA. This isn't any of your concern, witch, Lacey growled, her eyes so dark they were almost black. Boots hissed at her. The cold glare that Lacey was directing at me didn't scare me. Shouldn't you be in a coffin somewhere? I asked her. Sun's still out. Lacey launched over the counter, but I cast a shielding spell at the last moment, blocking her from me. She bounced off like a frisbee hitting a tree trunk. Her eyes narrowed to slits. You little... I arched a brow at her. Watch it, princess. I turned to Adam. And you. What on earth is your problem?
You're going to have to be more specific,
he replied, his grin still in place and his tone like honey, slow and lazy. Ugh. I narrowed my eyes. Why are you stirring up trouble with Lacey? It's fun, he said, shrugging his broad shoulders. You're that bored? I told you to go chase a bone at the park, Lacey offered, picking invisible lint off her Merlot t-shirt. Helpful, I muttered. That explained why Adam was bent out of shape. He gestured at Lacey and spread his hands.
Ice Queen over there was traipsing around in her crown and sash. What was I supposed to do, Holly? You know that's too much temptation for me.
I stifled a smile. Lacey had recently decided to participate in a Ms. Undead pageant. Or at least that's what Adam and I had taken to calling it when she wasn't around. Whatever it was actually called, it was a beauty pageant for supernaturals. And Lacey was determined to get the first place crown. She practiced constantly, mostly in the late afternoon between the time she woke up and the time the sun went down, since she couldn't leave the manor without being reduced to a pile of cinders. Lacey stomped her high-heel-clad foot on the tile floor and glared over at Adam. The pageant is in 3 weeks. I have to practice, and I can't do that with you mocking me, Lacey whined. I hated it when she whined. It gave me flashbacks to my academy days, listening to the prissy girls in my spellcraft classes. They weren't actually talented enough to be there, but had powerful parents who ensured their places in class. Since the lessons were over their pretty little heads, they would spend the entire lecture whining and gossiping in the back row. Adam spread his hands wide.
I can't help it if you look ridiculous.
Lacey started for him, hurtling over the counter. I casually flicked my wrist, throwing another invisible wall up between the two of them. I'd had enough. Stop it! Both of you! Adam chuckled, which only infuriated Lacey more. She bared her fangs at him, and he mocked an expression of horror.
What would the judges say about that face? It's not very pageanty. Pageant-esque.
Adam? I balled my hand tight to keep from slamming him with a stunning spell, if only to get him to shut up for 5 minutes.
Okay.
He pocketed his hands.
I'm done. I swear.
I eyed him suspiciously. I hope so. We have bigger problems to worry about than pageants. I hadn't planned on bringing those problems up, but if it would get them backed down a step from homicide, it would be worth it. Like what? Lacey asked, her tone incredulous, daring me to come up with something more important than her precious pageant. I sighed heavily. There's a paranormal investigator in town, and he's trying to lead a tour. Here, at the Beechwood Manor. What? Adam turned to face me, as though he'd forgotten Lacey existed altogether. He can't do that, Lacey exclaimed. I know. How did you find out? Adam asked. I caught him last night, sneaking around in the bushes under my window. It looked like he was taking pictures or video of the house. He came into Siren's song this morning, and I told him off again. But I wouldn't be surprised if he tried to get to one of you or... I rolled my eyes upward to the ceiling, toward the bedroom of our 4th roommate. Lacey shuddered.
Gary?
Adam supplied. I nodded. Although I would love to meet someone brave enough to talk to him. Adam chuckled.
He's not that bad, guys.
Lacey pursed her lips. He has a bad aura. Adam grinned and opened his mouth. I knew that whatever he was going to say would drag us away from helpful. I held up a hand, silently begging him to stop. He swallowed his comment and turned his attention back to the real problem.
What's this guy's name?
Nick Rivers? Apparently he's a private investigator from Los Angeles. I don't know what kind of case he's working, but he apparently moved up here recently. I had shockingly few details about him, considering that our 2 meetings had provided plenty of time to gather information, something that I was usually pretty good at. Anyway, he told me that he runs paranormal investigations on the side and heard about us. Well, more accurately, the Manor, and now he wants to lead a tour here. He even offered to cut me in on some of the profits. That's disgusting, Lacey scoffed, wrinkling her nose. Adam grinned sarcastically over at her. You sure about that, Lace? Sounds more like an evening buffet for your kind. You know, like one of those casino-style all-you-can-eat deals. I squeezed my eyes closed. Adam? Not helping. Lacey hissed and flashed her fangs at him. Boots growled and jumped up onto the counter between them. I darted forward and grabbed my brave, though ill-matched, cat and tucked him under my arm. Come on, guys. Let's work together. If Posey hears about this, she'll bust a gasket. And you all remember what happened last time. Lacey and Adam both sobered at my reminder. Posey was the original owner of the Beechwood Manor, along with her husband Earl. Earl was the businessman who had been largely responsible for raising Beechwood Harbor from a small fishing village into a thriving trade outpost. When Earl passed away, Posey went mad with grief and jumped off the cliffs. As a result, she'd become bonded to the manor and hadn't been able to find the peace she needed to fully let go of this world and move on to the next. Most of the time, she coped with her circumstances and remained well-balanced, though usually borderline grumpy. But there were times when it all got away from her and she'd make life miserable for the rest of us. Random, weird things would start happening around the house. A few months after I arrived in Beechwood Harbor, we discovered that the manor had a termite problem. The idea of a colony of termites gnawing through the foundation of the home she loved so much sent her over the edge. Before the exterminator could arrive to properly handle the insects, she'd flown into a panic and inadvertently jammed all the doors closed. Adam had been out running in the woods at the time and hadn't been able to get back in the front door. Instead, he'd been caught banging on the front door of the manor, buck naked, by Mrs. Miller and her Pomeranian Snowbell as they passed by on their evening walk. Lacey ended up trapped in her room and hadn't been able to go out for the night. The entire thing was a fiasco. Eventually, Posey calmed down and apologized, but she explained that sometimes it was out of her control. If things went wrong, especially things involving the manor, she panicked, and it was impossible to tell how that panic would affect the house itself. If she found out that a horde of tourists were going to show up with ghost-busting gear, I shuddered to think of the consequences. Okay, so what should we do? Lacey asked. Should we send Adam over to rough this investigator guy up? Thanks for volunteering me, Adam muttered. 10 minutes ago I was a flea bag, and now I'm your hero? Lacey rolled her eyes. Hero? Hardly. I handled it, I said, stopping her before she could go back to ripping into Adam again. At least I think I did. Gee, why doesn't that make me feel better? Lacey sneered, her tone dripping with sarcasm. Isn't there a spell you could cast on the house? A ward of some kind? Adam asked, surprisingly serious. I shrugged. Honestly, I hadn't really considered that. Maybe. I'll see what I can do. In the meantime, I made it clear that he isn't welcome, but if he tries to approach either of you, you've got to be careful. As it is, he already thinks the place is haunted. Which, to be fair, it is. Adam grinned, rebounding right back into unhelpful territory. Well, imagine how excited he'll get if he finds out that we not only have a ghost, but a vampire, shifter, witch, and, well, whatever Gary is. Adam scratched his chin. We really ought to figure that out. I can't place his scent. What does this Nick guy look like? Lacey asked, ignoring Adam. Here. I pulled the business card from my pocket and set it on the counter between them. Boots wriggled, and I plopped him down onto the hardwood floor. I was fairly certain the drama had passed and he was safe from his own bravado. The front side showed a thumbnail image of Nick, and the back provided his business details. "This address is for that new condo building they just finished putting up on the other side of town," Adam said, pointing at the line on the card. "He must have just moved in. I didn't even think those units were available yet. Pretty swanky from the looks of them." "He's kind of cute," Lacey said, grinning interestedly, something she never does. "Great," Adam shook his head. "Ms. Undead and the P.I. This love story basically writes itself." "Ah!" Lacey roared and lunged for Adam. He threw down the card and darted out of the kitchen before she could get around me and sink her claws or teeth into him. She turned to me, her cheeks flushed with anger. "He's such a... Slow down there, princess." I took the card from the counter and left Lacey fuming by herself in the kitchen. Hopefully, she'd crack open a can of O-positive and be back on the bright side before she really did go after Adam. I wasn't sure who would actually win a fight between the two of them. All I knew was that it wouldn't be pretty. Chapter 5. As I hurried to leave the manor early the next morning, I ran through Posey on my way to the front door. I jumped back a foot as an icy chill swept over me, soaking through my skin like a blast of mountain spring water. I shuddered at the frosty sensation and rubbed my arms. "Sorry, Posey, I didn't—" I winced as she sighed and finished my sentence.
"See me."
"Sorry," I mumbled again, still rubbing the goose flesh on my arms. Where was my sweater?
"That's all right. It's far more unpleasant for you than for me. Or at least that's what I've been told by others."
She was gazing off to some point past me. I turned around and didn't see anyone in the hall. It was my day to help Cassie open. Since we worked at a coffee shop, we had to wake up at an obscenely early hour. When I said goodbye to Boots and tiptoed out of the room, it was only a little past 4. The windows were dark, as the sun was still just thinking about rising. Posey turned her attention back to me.
"I wanted to catch you before you left to thank you for clearing up the commotion yesterday evening."
I ducked my chin. "Sure, of course."
"Those two can be positively beastly."
Posey shook her head. "I think it's repressed attraction," I commented dryly. Posey wrinkled her nose.
"Well, whatever it is, I'm glad you're here to keep them in check. They both run hot-tempered, and I'd hate to think what would happen if you weren't here to handle them. I don't know what we did before you arrived."
"Well, I've got nowhere else to go, so I guess you can rest assured that the chaos around here will be kept in check." I didn't mean to sound bitter, but as my statement echoed back, I heard it in my tone all the same. Posey nodded and floated off.
"Have a good day at work, dear."
"Thanks, Posey." I backtracked to my room to grab a sweater, still chilled from the run-in with my ghostly landlord. It's ironic that in death, Posey effectively ran a halfway house for supernaturals. In life, she would have been absolutely scandalized by the thought of mingling with such riffraff. Even without the supernatural part, we were still a rather motley crew. Lacey was probably the most normal one, as much as it pained me to admit it. She might be spoiled, entitled, and downright bratty, but on the outside, no one would ever assume she was anything other than a ritzy resident of the small community. She'd gathered an impressive collection of vintage designer clothes over the decades since her rebirth as a vampire. Her bottle blonde locks never faded, and would remain that perfect honey-toned blonde for all of eternity. And as she usually had oodles of spare time on her hands before nightfall, she was always coming up with new ways to style herself to princess perfection. I wasn't sure how she'd ended up at Beechwood Manor. Truthfully, I didn't know all that much about vampire communities in general. Still, it seemed to me that she could rocket to new heights and live a lavish life if she fell in with the right group. If she wanted to, she could escape the small town and be adored by dozens of vampire suitors. Then again, maybe that's what she was avoiding. Boots meowed grumpily as I popped back into the large room. "Hey, pal. Sorry to wake you. I can't stay because someone has to bring home the bacon. or in your case, kibble. I squatted down to pat his head as he peeked out from under the edge of the turquoise sheets. In my absence, he'd decided to take over the bed for himself. Let's cross our fingers that Nick doesn't come in to visit today. Then again, if he does, at least he's a decent tipper. I stood and waggled my fingers at Boots before he disappeared under the bedding again. Now I was going to be late. Siren Song was located a little over a mile away from the Beechwood Manor, and most days I kicked up a brisk pace and hoofed it to work. However, since I was running late, I went around the house and slipped into the thickly wooded tree line at the back of the property. I huddled in the dark and tugged my necklace free from under my shirt. The chain and locket were made from antique rose gold, and while it looked vintage, no one would be able to guess how old it actually was. The Larkspur. That was its name. The magically charged locket had been passed down through countless generations in my family to the most gifted witch in each new line. It was meant to propel them forward so that they might do even greater things than the generation before. Each time the locket was passed down, a bit of the previous owner remained with the necklace, granting additional power to the new guardian. My Aunt Bethany had gifted the Larkspur to me on my 17th birthday, after I completed my formal academy training. Her greatest power had been the ability to hop from one place, or possibly even time, if rumors were to be believed, to another. So far, I'd only managed short distances, like from the manor to work. Siren Song, I whispered, running my thumb over the warm metal. When I opened my eyes, I was standing in the back alley behind the mega-sized dumpster. I sighed with relief. I didn't use the power of hopping often. It was a dangerous kind of magic, tinkering with the unknown. But I'd carefully trained myself to appear in the alley behind the dumpster to avoid being caught. No one would ever see me appear there. If I were to show up in the middle of the cafe during business hours in front of a rush hour crowd, well, that would be bad. Harvey, my assigned agent with the Supernatural Protection Agency, or SPA, though there was nothing spa-like about dealing with the brutes, would have me permanently relocated to the other world. I tucked the locket back under my shirt and stood from my crouched position. A strange scent was floating through the air on the early morning breeze. Peppermint. And strong. I fished the shop keys from my front pocket, flipped to the right one for the back door, and rounded the dumpster. I took 2 steps into the weak pool of light shining from the small, exposed bulb beside the steel security door, and froze in place. 5 feet away, someone was sprawled face down on the pavement. A chill ran over me, and I nervously glanced over my shoulder to make sure I was truly alone and hadn't stumbled into the middle of something. I flicked my wrist, and a small orb of light hovered a fraction of an inch from my fingertips. I held up my hand and forced myself to take small, tentative steps toward whoever was laying in the alley. I licked my lips and cleared my throat. Hello? Excuse me. Do you... I only made it a few steps and gasped. There was a large, dark puddle pooled under the person's head. Every instinct screamed at me to run fast and to not look back. Better yet, hop back to the manor and pretend I never left. Let this atrocity become someone else's problem. But I couldn't tear myself away. I took the final steps to the body and stooped over, lowering the magic ball of blue light to the person's head to get a closer look. With my free hand, I brushed away the damp hair and gasped when I recognized the profile that was mashed against the pavement. Peg Holloway was dead. Once I realized who I was looking at, the rest of the details of the scene flooded over me. I spun around, taking it all in, desperately trying to figure out what had happened. The first thing I noticed was that the nauseating scent of peppermint had grown stronger. I covered my mouth and scanned the area. An old beat-up sedan was hulking in the shadows, and I recognized it immediately as Peg's. She would sometimes back it down the narrow alley to unload supplies rather than carting them through the front door of the shop. However, she never came in before the opening shift. In fact, she'd given me a set of keys within 2 weeks of getting hired on, solely so she wouldn't have to open the shop in the event one of the regular openers was sick and unable to come in. I thought it odd to trust someone who had just been brought on staff, but that had been before I'd realized the full extent of Peg's aversion to mornings. She wouldn't have been unloading supplies this early. That meant that this had happened the night before, after she closed up with Frankie and Cassie. I shuddered at the awful truth and pulled my collar up closer against my neck as all the hairs along the back were standing up. "What do I do now?" I whispered to myself, spinning in a small circle. I tossed the orb of light higher, spreading fragments of light over the full scene so that I could possibly figure out what had happened. There were 3 broken bottles of peppermint syrup lying on the ground under the bumper of her car, like they'd been sitting on the trunk and had fallen to the pavement below. Well, at least that explained the overpowering smell. For some reason, the people in Beechwood Harbor were obsessed with peppermint drinks. Even though it was a beachside community, people still wanted peppermint mochas and cocos. Some even asked to have a splash of the sticky sweet syrup added to their afternoon tea. It was like the town was set in some kind of eternal Christmas mode. Peg had to purchase 3 or 4 bottles at a time to keep us stocked up. Staring down at the shattered remains of the bottles, gagging on the scent, I had a feeling I would never be able to smell peppermint again without thinking back to this moment. I scanned the area one more time, but didn't see anything out of the ordinary. Nothing made sense, though. Why would someone have killed Peg? Had they robbed her? I crept down the alley, careful not to step on anything, and called the orb of light over. The door to Peg's car was still open, so I peered inside. Her leather purse was sitting on the passenger seat, and a few folded-up $20 bills were stashed in the cup holder beside a siren song tumbler in the center console. So, apparently not a robbery gone wrong, unless they panicked when it went awry. Through the noise and chatter in my brain, a new question entered the mix. Where was Cassie? She should already be inside. She opened most days, and usually arrived at the shop long before me. Cassie was the opposite of Peg, in that she loved morning shifts and was always there, a smile on her face, and half the morning checklist already completed by the time I rolled in the door. I tiptoed to the back door and tried the doorknob. It was still locked. What was going on? I pulled my phone from my pocket and checked for a message from Cassie. Maybe she had car trouble. Nothing. Maybe she already found Peg and had gone to get help? Were the police already on their way? I snapped my fingers and the orb of light popped like a bubble, leaving the alley dim and dank again. Another chill crept over me at the thought of being alone in a dark alley with a dead body. But at the same time, it didn't feel right leaving Peg alone. I put my key into the lock and let myself into the back room. I left the door propped open and stood in the doorway so that I could still keep an eye on the alley while I called the police. The dispatcher on the other end spoke with the cadence and volume of a zombie, and for a moment I wondered if she'd missed the part where I told her there was a dead body at my place of employment. "The police are on their way, ma'am. Stay with me," she repeated for the 6th time in the span of 5 minutes. "I am," I replied, irritated. From my position, the body was out of sight, obscured by the door. I peeked around the edge as I waited for the police. The body was still there. I didn't know what I expected. I'd been around lots of undead. I lived with a ghost and a vampiress, for crying in a cauldron. But dealing with the actual dead? That was a different thing altogether. Chapter 6.
So tell me again from the beginning. How did you come across the victim?
I bit back a frustrated sigh at Police Chief Lincoln's question. We'd gone through my story 3 times already, and I was beginning to feel less like a concerned citizen and more like a suspect. I walked to work. Well, mostly. When I came down the alley to go in the back door, I saw the body. I couldn't help but look past Chief Lincoln's squared shoulder to the sheet that was covering Peg's body while we waited for the coroner to arrive. "And then?" Chief Lincoln said, his tone gentler this time. I pulled my gaze back to him. "I went inside, called the police, and here we are." Jeffrey Lincoln, the Beechwood Harbor police chief, gave me a lie detector stare, as though he could peek right into my head and read every thought. It was unnerving, to say the least, especially since I was fudging the part about walking to work. But what was I supposed to say? I appeared at work? Sure, I'd skip out on jail time and go straight to the asylum instead. That would definitely be a bad thing. Historically, asylums weren't exactly known for being kind to my people. Chief Lincoln continued his interrogation. "And did you touch the body? Or anything present at the scene?" The frustrated sigh I'd been holding back slipped out. "No, I didn't touch anything. I swear." Chief Lincoln bristled and jotted down a note. "Okay, Ms. Bolt. Thank you for the information. We'll follow up if we need anything else." Fantastic. I understand. I glanced beyond him toward the crime scene, now blocked off with thick yellow tape that read, "Police line, do not cross." "So what now?" Chief Lincoln followed my stare. "I'll begin processing the scene. A team of forensics experts are already en route." The morning light was starting to creep through the alley, and my stomach clenched at the thought of Peg just lying out there, possibly for hours, while the police team investigated. Beechwood Harbor was a small town, and this was big news. A crowd of people would soon form, hovering and gawking as the police worked. The gossip would rip through town like wildfire. "Oh my gosh!" I whipped around at Cassie's breathless cry. She was standing on the other side of the tape, her hands over her mouth, as her eyes darted between the police tape, Chief Lincoln, and me, then coming to rest on Peg's body. I called to her. "Cass!" She ducked under the tape and came over to us. "What happened?" she exclaimed, her eyes locked on Chief Lincoln. He headed her off. "Excuse me, miss. You'll need to leave. This is a crime scene." Cassie's expression turned stormy, and she planted her fists on her curvy hips as Chief Lincoln continued toward her. "Miss? Don't give me that, Jeffrey. We've known each other since grade school." I reared back, surprised by her fortitude. Cassie, my even-keeled, gentle friend and co-worker, had transformed into a formidable woman who wasn't going to be placated or ordered about. I glanced at Chief Lincoln and saw his shock register as well. "Grade school? Really?" The question slipped out before I could rein it in. Cassie nodded at me and then shifted her eyes to Chief Lincoln. "Now, what happened?" He sighed and put away his little notebook. "Cassie, Peg's been, well, she's passed away." Chief Lincoln's tone bordered on sweetness, and it seriously freaked me out. What happened to the hard-ass detective routine he gave me? His dark, deep-set eyes considered Cassie carefully. "I'm sorry you had to find out this way. Please, let me escort you." Cassie shook her head. "No, that isn't possible. What happened?" Chief Lincoln took a step to his right, blocking Cassie's view of the body behind his stocky shoulders. I hadn't realized before how close in age he was to us. I supposed his position of power had tricked my brain into thinking he was older. Police chief seemed like a title that was reserved for older, more distinguished officers. If Jeffrey Lincoln and Cassie had known each other since grade school, that would put him in his late 20s, maybe his early 30s. The perks of living in a small town, I suppose. Early promotions were possible, even likely, when there were only 3 or 4 positions to fill and only a handful of people vying for the job. "I can't give you the details, but I would like to ask you some questions," he said, his tone marshmallow soft. I was clearly missing something. Just what exactly did Cassie's past with Chief Lincoln entail? I'd never seen him so soft-spoken before. He turned to Cassie and took her elbow. Cass, please, don't make this harder.
Holly, you found her like this?
Cassie asked, sidestepping out of Chief Lincoln's reach.
I'm so sorry.
She came to me and wrapped her arms around me. We clung to each other for a long moment. Chief Lincoln shifted from foot to foot like he wasn't sure what to do with the pair of us.
Are you okay?
Cassie asked as we broke apart. Her bright eyes welled with tears. I nodded. I'm okay. I didn't see anything happen. She was already... The rest of my answer trailed off, and my eyes landed back on the sheet covering her body. Ladies, please. I need to ask you to leave. Let me escort you back to the other side of the tape. This alley, as well as the shop, is part of the investigation. He started to herd us toward the mouth of the alley, putting out an arm to keep either of us from stepping on anything that might be considered evidence.
The shop, too?
Cassie asked.
What about all our customers?
I furrowed my brow. It was an odd question, all things considered. But I knew funds were tight for Cassie. She was the main breadwinner in her family of 3. Her father had been injured on the job years ago and only raked in a small stipend from a workman's comp settlement, along with a paltry disability check. Her younger sister Kira was only 18 and worked part-time at Siren Song on the weekends. She attended community college during the week. Their mother had passed away from cancer when they were young. I wrapped an arm around my friend. I didn't have a lot of money, at least not the kind of cash that would make a difference to Cassie and her family, but I would see what I could do to help her through the period of lost wages. It'll be okay, Cass. Chief Lincoln will get this all sorted out. I don't really think I could focus on work right now anyway. She nodded solemnly, and I caught a tinge of pink on her cheeks. I hoped she wasn't silently beating herself up for asking the question. Chief Lincoln got us past the tape, and I walked Cassie back to her house, which was just a few blocks from the shop. We walked in silence, neither of us knowing what to say. When we reached the end of Cassie's driveway, she paused and pocketed her hands.
What am I supposed to tell my dad and Kira?
Just tell them what happened. You know the entire town will know everything by lunchtime anyway. Cassie nodded. She glanced up the narrow drive that was barely wide enough for one car. It led to a detached garage and a ranch-style home that had a charming, albeit slightly run-down, appearance.
That's true. Nothing stays quiet in this town for long.
I laughed softly. I'm starting to learn that. Cassie nodded and then went back to fidgeting. She tugged at the end of her French braid. I touched her shoulder. Cass, it's going to be okay.
It's just so strange. I mean, this is Beechwood Harbor. Who could have done such a thing? How could something like this happen here?
I shrugged, wondering the same thing myself. I don't know, Cass. Haven systems were different than human societies, but that didn't mean they were immune to violence. Things got particularly dicey when different species, such as werewolves and vampires, clashed. Those two groups had always hated each other and were constantly stirring up trouble. There were also different houses of vampires, and sometimes the different families would war with one another. However, I had never directly seen the result of such battles. Peg was the first dead person I'd ever seen, and the experience still had me on edge. I was barely holding it together for Cassie's sake.
What do you think will happen to the shop? I know that's a selfish thing to be worried about right now, but
it's not, Cass. You have to give yourself some slack. I'm sure Peg had some kind of plan in place. A silent partner or family member that is listed in her will to take over. Cassie nodded slowly.
That makes sense.
Don't worry about it. Everyone in town knows your family. Even if Siren Song closes, someone will give you and Kira new jobs. I'm sure of it. The green front door of the house swung open, and a large golden retriever bolted out into the front yard. Her father's voice called out, "Cassie? What are you doing back home?" Cassie turned to face her dad, who was collecting the paper from the front porch. He stooped over slowly and reached for the bundle with his fingertips. The strain was obvious and made my heart ache. Cassie patted her dog, Creamsicle, on the head and then jogged up the drive to help her dad. She grabbed the paper and handed it to him.
Come on inside, Dad. I'll explain.
She turned back to wave goodbye to me.
I'll see you later, Holly. Thanks for walking with me.
I waved goodbye and waited until Cassie, her dad, and the happy-go-lucky pup were all inside the house before I took off back through town toward the manor. The early morning sun was starting to poke through the clouds, but was accompanied by a light smattering of rain. Despite my reluctance to see the crime scene again, I found myself back on Zinnia, the main street through town. When I neared Siren Song, I glanced across the street and saw that more officers had arrived on the scene. The rain was coming down harder, and I hoped it wouldn't make the forensic team's life more difficult. The entire town would be in an uproar until the killer was identified and put behind bars. And despite my differences with the woman, Peg deserved closure as she crossed over to the other world. I knew firsthand what the effects of an unfinished life looked like, and it wasn't pretty. Case in point, the borderline neurotic ghost waiting at home. I hunched my shoulders up and rubbed my hands up and down my arms to aid circulation, already dreaming of the cup of warm tea I would have when I arrived back at the manor. I tugged the collar of my sweater up and returned my attention back to the sidewalk in front of me, just in time to run smack dab into a solid wall of muscle. "Fancy meeting you here," a now familiar and annoying voice said as I bounced back. "Hello, Nick," I grumbled. "Was it time for bed yet?" Chapter 7. "Why do you smell like a candy cane factory?" Nick asked, his nose wrinkling at the pervasive scent still clinging to my clothes. I had become immune to the strong odor after standing in the cloud of it for over an hour. I didn't even realize it was wafting off of me. I sighed and rubbed the bridge of my nose. "It's a long story." He smiled down at me as I scrambled to put another 6 inches of space between us. "I'd love to hear it." "I'm sure you would." He chuckled. "Well, as it turns out, you're off the hook. I'm on my way to the scene of a murder. Heard anything about it?" My eyebrows shot up. "How do you even know about that?" I sputtered. Most, if not all, of the core pieces of the town gossip mill would still be sleeping. Where was Nick getting his information? "I have a police scanner in my apartment," he said, as though it was the most natural thing in the world. "Of course you do," I quipped. I took a step to the side. "Well, have fun? It's not exactly a pretty picture." Nick pocketed his hands and gave me a grim look. "You were there?" I shook my head. "Not when it all happened, but I was the one who found her." My voice drifted off as the mental image of Peg sprawled in the alley cycled back through my mind. I wondered if I would ever fully be able to get rid of it. Mind magic was a risky art, but I was seriously considering trying my hand at some kind of eraser potion. "I'm sorry, Holly. I didn't realize." My eyes darted back to Nick. His sincerity caught me off guard. "I'll be all right. I just feel bad for Peg and her family." "Of course." Nick nodded solemnly. "Was it your first?" "First what?" I asked in confusion. "Body." "Oh." I rubbed my arms, fighting off the chill seeping through the thin fabric of my favorite sweater. I wanted nothing more than to get home and sink up to my nose in a hot bath. "Yeah. Hopefully my last, too." Nick bobbed his head. "Right. Well, murder investigations aren't exactly my favorite either. There's no possible chance of a happy solution, you know." I looked at him quizzically. "Then why are you going to the scene?" "It's time I introduce myself to the local authorities and see if I can offer any assistance. Kind of part of the whole new PI in town thing." "Ah. Well, good luck. I hope they can solve this thing really soon. Me too. Take care of yourself, Nick, I said, moving to pass by him. You too, Holly. If you need anything, let me know. I nodded, though I wasn't sure why. I still didn't want Nick getting too close. He needed to find another haunted mansion. Mine was off limits. I waved and hurried the next mile to get back to the manor. I managed to make it to the door just as the rain shifted from a sprinkle into big, fat drops.
Is it true?
I jumped at Posey's impatient question as I pushed the door open. I clutched a hand to my chest as my heart hammered violently against my ribs. She was staring down at me from the foot of the grand staircase. Bat wings, Posey! You scared me! She continued to glare at me, impatiently waiting for the answer to her initial question. If she had the ability to tap her foot against the floor, it would have been going a mile a minute. Is what true? What are you talking about? I asked, buying myself some time as I stepped into the foyer and closed the front door against the chill.
The murder!
Posey's eyes darted around the room.
Gwen was over here raving about the whole thing.
That explained it. Gwen was a notorious ghost in Beechwood Harbor. She dedicated her life, or death, to the pursuit of gossip. She floated through the neighborhood, gathering the juiciest tidbits and then spread them as far as she could. As only other supers could see her, she didn't have a huge audience. But she and Posey got on nicely and were known to spend afternoons whispering in the sitting room or kitchen about who was up to what. I could just imagine her flying over as quickly as ghostly possible to tell Posey all about the murder. Gwen had been dead for 50 years, and her style reflected it. She had long, free-flowing blonde locks, feather earrings, and a floral print romper that showed off her mile-long legs. She'd be forever 25, after dying in a tragic stage diving accident at an outdoor music festival. Watching her and Posey together was amusing, the differences between them as stark as night and day. If they'd met in life, I doubted either of them would have wanted anything to do with the other. It appeared that standards got lower when you could count on 2 hands the number of people who even knew you existed. I locked the latch on the front door and turned back to face Posey. Did Gwen see anything? Or hear about it from someone else?
She was flying through on her morning rounds and saw the crowd at the mouth of the alley. She stopped to see what was causing such a ruckus and saw the body as they were shoving her into a body bag. She said there was a lot of blood.
Posey shuddered.
What happened?
I shook my head. I really don't know, Posey. I showed up for my shift and she was there, already dead. I called the police, and Chief Lincoln showed up with another deputy to lock down the scene. He questioned me for an hour or so and then cut me loose. Chief Lincoln said they have a forensics team coming in. That's all I know. Posey frowned, processing the information I'd given her.
So tragic. Who would do such a thing?
I don't know. I mean, Peg didn't exactly have a reputation for being the town's saint, but it's hard to imagine someone wanting her dead. Posey shimmered and headed for the door.
I think I'll go stroll around town and see for myself.
She floated through the front door, and I sighed to myself. I was torn between going back to my warm bed and doing something more productive with my unexpected day off. In the end, sleep won out. I woke to a frantic pounding. Sunlight was streaming through the windows, and I realized from the angle of the light that I'd been out all morning. The pounding started again, and I jumped out of bed to see what was so urgent. I jumped into my jeans and a cozy hooded sweatshirt before I ran out to the foyer to open the door. It occurred to me after the fact that I should probably be more careful whom I opened the door for, considering there was potentially a killer on the loose in the neighborhood. Luckily, I didn't find an axe-wielding psycho on the front porch. Instead, it was Cassie. Her skin was so pale that she could give Posey a run for her money. She met my wide-eyed stare with a panicked look. She was terrified.
Holly, you have to help me.
What's wrong? I asked, stepping aside to usher her in. Normally, I would have gone out to speak with her on the porch, just in case an oversized dog/man or cranky vampiress with low blood sugar came downstairs. But considering the circumstances, I couldn't ask Cassie to chat with me on the porch. Her hands were shaking as she tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear.
Holly, I think they think I did it.
My brain was still a bit muddled by sleep, so I didn't immediately grasp what she meant. Did what? She glanced around with nervous, shifting eyes before sweeping them back to mine.
They think I murdered Peg.
What? I took a step back, reeling at the suggestion. Why would you even say that? She swallowed hard.
I just finished talking to Jeff. Chief Lincoln. He came by my house to question me about Peg's murder.
I arched a brow. Why hadn't he questioned her when we were all together? I'd only been napping for a few hours. Had they found some clue that pointed to Cassie? Back up for a minute. Chief Lincoln actually told you that you're a suspect? The entire idea was almost laughable. Cassie was like a wildflower, gentle and beautiful. She didn't have a mean bone in her body, let alone a murderous one.
Not in so many words,
she replied, shaking her head. But there's something you don't know. Come on in. Let's go get you a cup of tea or something while you fill me in, I said, taking her by the elbow. I wasn't going to make her spill her guts right there in the front entry. I led her to the spacious kitchen and gestured for her to take a seat at the large farm-style table that dominated the eat-in dining area. Okay. Start at the beginning. Cassie took in a deep breath.
Yesterday, after you left the shop, Peg and I got into an argument.
An argument? I was beginning to sound like a juvenile pixie, repeating everything she said. I left her at the table and crossed to the stove where a large bright green enameled steel kettle was sitting on the stove. It wasn't a cauldron, but it did the job quite nicely without drawing too much attention from the handful of non-supers who stopped by the manor from time to time. A copper spout was built into the wall, its pipes creeping up the checkered backsplash. I tugged the spout over to the kettle and turned on the water to fill the pot. I turned on the front burner once the kettle was full, then rummaged through my personal tea cupboard beside the stove while the water heated. It would all be a lot more efficient with magic, but even though Cassie was distracted by her own dark thoughts, I didn't want to risk pulling out any tricks. What was the argument about? I asked, before pulling out an earth-colored ceramic container of my favorite blend of calming tea, a potent mixture of exotic herbs and spices from my own greenhouse behind the manor. I called it a tension tamer. Looking at her hands, Cassie said dully,
Peg accused me of stealing from the till.
I dropped the small wooden scoop back into the tin and spun to face Cassie. Are you serious? Cassie nodded.
She said she'd been observing me for a while, and that my till counts were off. She knew, that my family was struggling for money. I guess she connected those two things and jumped to a conclusion.
Oh, Cass, that's awful.
I've had a few nights recently when I didn't balance out, but I thought someone had just miscounted when giving change back. It's not like I'm the only employee, and it was never a significant amount.
My stomach churned as I tried to recall if I'd been at fault for the accounting errors. Having grown up in the Haven system, I hadn't been forced to learn American currency until much later in life. Before coming to Beechwood Harbor, I used it so sporadically that it was something I struggled to learn in my new job. If anyone had made a mistake behind the till, it was probably me. And now Cassie was suffering for my mistake.
She said that I owed her $500, and that if I didn't pay it back by the end of the week, she was going to have to fire me.
Cassie continued, her face glum.
And Kira, too.
Wow. I wonder what crawled into her boots.
Boots?
Cassie looked over at me, her pert nose wrinkled.
I don't think I've ever seen Peg wear boots. I mentally kicked myself. It's just an expression. I don't know that I've heard that one. The kettle sang, and I hurried to pour the steaming water into 2 teacups from the cupboard above the stove. Each cup got a hearty scoop of the tension tamer blend and a generous dollop of honey. I wiggled my fingers over the tops of the cups to swirl the content. No point in dirtying a spoon. And then took them over to the table. Thanks, Cassie said, glancing down to her cup of murky liquid. I smiled. It tastes better than it looks. I promise. She laughed softly. Sorry. I didn't mean... Cass, don't apologize. I sat down on the upholstered chair at the head of the table beside Cassie. So how did the argument with Peg end? It didn't really. I got mad, told her she was off her rocker, and stormed out. That's why I wasn't there this morning for opening. My alarm went off just like normal, but I silenced it. I figured if I was going to get fired anyway, why bother? But then my backup alarm went off, and I gave myself a pep talk. I decided to go and prove her wrong. I need that job. Even if it barely pays the bills, it's better than nothing. I nodded. That explained why I was the first to arrive at the shop. Well, be glad you didn't show up early. It wasn't pretty. Cassie frowned. I'm sorry, Holly. You shouldn't have had to deal with that one all alone. Gosh, what a disaster. Majorly. I took a sip of tea. The bitterness of the herbs balanced out with the sweetness of the honey into a pleasant, mild flavor that warmed me through and made me want to crawl back into my bed. How did Chief Lincoln find out about the argument, though? Cassie's cheeks went red. The conversation wasn't exactly private. I arched a brow at her. It started back in her office, but kind of spilled out, and everyone that was in the shop at the time heard the worst parts. Oh, no. I winced. Cassie sighed and arched a brow. Yeah, not my finest hour. I can't even remember the last time I was that worked up. I reached over and placed my hand on top of hers. I'm sure this will get cleared up. Sure, you had an argument, but who doesn't? Everyone has conflict and disagreements sometimes. No one in this town could actually think you murdered Peg. She smiled at me weakly. Thanks, Holly. I squeezed her hand. Besides, by that logic, Greta killed her. She and Peg fight like cats and dogs every other day. Cassie laughed, but then covered her mouth, her eyes going wide. Oh, I shouldn't laugh. I mean, she's dead. True. Sorry. But you're probably right, she added, her smile returning slightly. By next week, no one will even remember the argument between you and Peg. The gossip mill around here is relentless, but at least they cycle through things pretty quickly. Cassie was doubtful. Yeah, but a murder? Nothing like that has happened here as far back as I can remember. I can't imagine everyone forgetting about it anytime soon. This is going to have some serious sticking power. The police will find the clues and scratch your name off their list. Cassie fidgeted with the gilded handle of her teacup. Her fingers circled the rim as she spun it around. I hope you're right. Don't worry, Cass. We're going to figure this out. Besides, it sounds like you and Chief Lincoln have some history. I'm sure he knows this wasn't you. Cassie nodded, but her eyes were still filled with angst. We went to school together. He was a couple of years ahead of me. He invited me to senior prom, actually, when I was still a sophomore. My eyebrows shot up. Oh, really? As a witch, I hadn't gone to traditional school, and witch schools didn't have things like prom, but I'd watched enough sitcoms to know it was a huge deal. Yeah, I turned him down, though. I bit back a laugh. Why? I had a crush on his friend Mark, and didn't want him to think I was with Jeffrey. Drama, I teased, offering her a warm smile. That's high school for you. Right. I nodded, looking away as if conjuring my own school memories from the recesses of my mind.
When I was a teenager, I was far more concerned with perfecting my summoning spells and making sure my potion kit was properly stocked than worrying about dances and student body elections.
So, what do you think I should do?
Cassie asked, her small voice drawing me back to the Manor's bright kitchen. I know someone who can give me some advice if it gets that far, I offered, drumming my fingers on the table and thinking back to Nick's offer.
Really?
Cassie's eyes brightened, and she perked up in her seat.
That would be great, Holly. I knew you'd know what to do. You're the best.
I smiled and took a deep sip from the dainty teacup, drawing in as much of the calming tea blend as I could. I was sure he would help me if I asked, but to seek out Nick Rivers, I would have to be pretty darn desperate. Chapter 8. Good afternoon, gorgeous. Adam bounded down the stairs just as I was seeing Cassie out of the Manor. She turned back and peeked around the door at his greeting, and her cheeks flushed. Adam turned his charm up a few notches when he saw her, gracing her with a 1,000-watt smile. Oh, hello, Cassie. I didn't see you. I rolled my eyes and returned my attention to my friend. I'll call you later, Cass. I found it was best to ignore Adam, especially when he went into full-on flirt mode, which happened to be about 90% of the time. If he wasn't eating or sleeping, he was flirting, or in pursuit of his next target. As far as I could tell, he was harmless. Sometimes I wondered if he even realized he was doing it. Shifters had a reputation for being shameless flirts, but considering I'd never seen Adam bring a girlfriend home for the night, I wasn't sure how often he backed up his words with action. The stars above knew he could have any woman he wanted. Well, except for me. Adam personified tall, dark, and handsome. He was at least 6'2", with broad, strong shoulders that made any t-shirt look good. He had dark, almost black hair that he kept cut short. His eyes were just as dark, but usually illuminated with a glint of mischief that accompanied a wicked, half-cocked grin that was hard to ignore. His square jaw was often coated with dark scruff that completed his bad boy persona to perfection. He was definitely 6+ feet of sheer trouble. Cassie looked about ready to swoon. I caught her eye, and she blushed all the more, stuttering her goodbyes.
Thanks, Holly. Bye, Adam.
He raised a hand and flashed his signature smile. The poor girl faltered, stumbling over the threshold. She giggled to herself as she course-corrected and crossed the front porch. Adam chuckled behind me, and I rolled my eyes as I closed the door. Don't congratulate yourself too hard over there, Adam. I've recently realized that Cassie has shockingly low standards. You're grumpy, he pouted, crossing his arms as I spun around and started for the kitchen. I'm not grumpy. I could hear Adam on my heels, but didn't stop to address him. What's wrong? He asked, as we both went through the swinging door into the kitchen. If you're not grumpy, then what is it? You seem tense. I pursed my lips and pivoted on my heel, swirling around to face him. Gee, I wonder why. It's not like I found a dead body this morning or anything. Dead body? Adam cocked his head, then smiled. Did Lacey get a hold of that paranormal investigator guy you told us about? I shivered at the dark thought. No, he's alive and well. Probably still lurking around the crime scene like a dog begging for table scraps. That's offensive, he retorted, stalking across the kitchen to the floor-to-ceiling wall of cabinets that made up the pantry. I squeezed my eyes shut. Right. Adam technically was a dog. Sorry. You know what I meant. I get it. You're not a dog person. At least not yet. He turned his head and waggled his eyebrows at me. I scoffed and went back to refreshing my cup of tea. I clearly needed a second dose. It's more that Boots isn't a fan, I deadpanned. Adam chuckled, and I relaxed slightly. Even though he drove me crazy, I didn't want him to think I was trying to be mean to him. So, who bit the dust? He asked curiously. I bristled. Do you have to say it like that? He huffed a sigh and turned back to face me, a jumbo-sized jar of peanut butter in his hand. Fine. Who died? Peg Holloway, I replied, sinking back into my seat at the table, my fresh cup of tea steaming. What? His teasing grin dropped away instantly. His eyes flashed with concern. Really? Yeah. I nodded and set my tea back on the table. I got to work this morning and found her in the alley behind the shop. Dead. How? I don't know exactly, but it looked like she'd been hit on the head, and there were broken bottles of flavored syrups all over the ground by her car. Let me guess. Peppermint? The clothes I'd been wearing at the crime scene were buried in the hamper in my room. How could Adam still smell it on me? Do I still smell? A little bit. But then again, I have an excellent nose. Adam strolled across the kitchen and took a spoon from the drawer. I wasn't going to say anything, but since you brought it up, yeah, it's probably in your hair. I lifted the end of my ponytail to my nose and breathed deeply. Yup, peppermint. I groaned and flopped back in my chair. Great. I need to practice some kind of cleaning charm. It's just because I'm a shifter, Halls. No one else probably noticed. Adam laughed softly and twisted the lid from the jar in his hands. He dug in with a spoon and came up with the biggest glob of peanut butter I'd ever seen. I marveled as Adam worked his mouth around the towering bite. I grimaced as he swallowed it down. How can you eat it like that? I'd feel like I was suffocating. Death by peanut butter. I suppose there were worse ways to go. I like peanut butter. Adam shrugged. I think your feelings are a little stronger than that, I teased, grateful for the infusion of levity to the somber conversation. Adam was always good for a laugh, mostly at his own expense, but he was a good sport. Don't be too jealous, gorgeous. He grinned and flashed me a wink. I scoffed, but couldn't hold back a laugh. You really are something else. He chuckled and fished out another massive bite of peanut butter. He paused, considering the glob on the end of his spoon. Well, at least the murder case gets one problem off of our plate, he said, before stuffing the spoon into his mouth. I cringed. You mean besides earning me an extra day off? He laughed. That too. I actually meant keeping the paranormal investigator out of our business. Maybe with a murder investigation, he'll be too busy to nose around here. Oh, right. I suppose so. I nodded slowly, but then shifted my eyes back to Adam. But something tells me he's not finished with us for good. It's not like Chief Lincoln is going to let him anywhere near the crime scene. Adam snorted. Ain't that the truth? That man gives new meaning to the term uptight. You just don't like him because he comes out to scare you off when you're invading the dumpster behind McNally's. Hey, dogs gotta eat. He shrugged, unconcerned. That was the other thing about Adam. He radiated confidence and didn't care what anyone else thought about him. He owned who he was and made it look good. McNally's has the best dumpster in town. I can't help it. I laughed. I know. Well, no, actually I don't, but the food inside the restaurant is good, so I get the gist. Adam had tried to explain shifting to me on multiple occasions. Most shifters cloaked their ability with a certain amount of secrecy. Not Adam. Adam was loud and proud. He'd tell you anything about anything. The only problem was figuring out whether he actually knew what he was talking about, or if it was all hot air. But when it came to shifter magic, I trusted his first-hand experience. According to him, shifters weren't like werewolves, where the change was inevitable, a monthly curse. Shifters could change at will. I'd asked him why shifters change at all. Why not just live a normal life? Most werewolves I'd talked to said they wished they could control their power, harness it, and make it more like shifting. Not that they would ever say it exactly that way. They would never want to come across as jealous of shifters. In any case, Adam had explained that with shifters, the magic builds up inside and eventually needs to be channeled into shifting. Apparently, it was also quite fun. Adam liked to shift on a regular basis, to stretch his legs, run through the woods, and be wild and free. However, after a long night of running the woods, he usually wound up in town, dumpster diving his way through the best leftovers that Beechwood Harbor had to offer. Obviously, you wouldn't eat out of a dumpster if it was by choice. I paused to consider him. At least I don't think you would. Adam laughed and screwed the cap back on the peanut butter jar. It's a hell of a lot cheaper that way, he said, flashing me a mischievous grin. I grimaced. I think I'll stick to takeout. Suit yourself. He pushed up from his chair and went to put the peanut butter back in the cabinet, tossing a glance over his shoulder. What was Cassie doing here this afternoon? Was she coming to see me now that she has the day off? I rolled my eyes and gulped down some more tea. No, surprisingly enough, she was not. She's worried that she's going to be a suspect. Of the murder? Adam screwed up his face in an almost comical expression of bewilderment. She's just being paranoid, which is exactly what I told her. Adam stashed the peanut butter back in the cupboard. His tidiness was his one redeeming quality, and came to sit beside me at the table. Why would she even think that? I mean, I don't know her that well because she usually gets all shy and flustered around me. He sat back in his chair and puffed his chest out. I tend to have that effect. Adam, he laughed. Just saying. Seriously, though, I can't imagine someone like her ever being accused of hurting anyone, let alone murdering them. Yeah, me either. But I guess she and Peg had a loud argument last night. Peg accused her of stealing from the till. Ouch. I nodded. From what she said, it wasn't pretty. But I don't think that's enough to flag her as a suspect. I'm sure the questions were just protocol. You know, part of the investigation. Shake every tree. I shrugged. Besides, she's got someone on the inside who will watch her back. What do you mean? I jolted, realizing that I'd said the last part out loud. It hadn't been meant for him. Oh, nothing, really. I just didn't realize that she and Chief Lincoln have known each other since grade school. Really? Yeah. Apparently a little bit of an unrequited romance on the Chief's part in their later years of high school. Double ouch. I laughed. That was a while ago. They seemed perfectly fine today. I'm sure Chief Lincoln will figure this case out soon and it will blow over. Hopefully. Adam leaned back in his chair, mulling over everything I'd explained. The kitchen door banged open and Lacey stalked into the room. Wrinkling her nose, she turned to me. What is that stench? I winced and spun around in my seat. Good morning, Princess of Darkness, Adam purred at Lacey's entrance. It's a little early for you, isn't it? With all the banging on the door, it was hard to stay asleep. Lacey glared at him, then shifted her angry stare to me. What have you been doing in here? I can smell the magic. No, you can't, I retorted before drinking down the rest of my tea. It was time to go. I smell something, she growled, stalking across the kitchen to the fridge. Peppermint? Adam offered, smirking over at me. I sighed. I made tea. That's all, Lacey. Magic tea, she corrected, wrinkling her nose. Fine, you caught me, Lacey. A witch just made magical tea. Someone call the Haven Herald to run an exclusive. Adam smiled at me and looked down at the remnants in the bottom of my cup. Was it really? I wonder why I didn't pick up on that. Because you're useless, Lacey offered as she closed the fridge, her hand wrapped around a white can with a gold label on the outside. She cracked the can open, crossed over to the china cabinet, and retrieved a crystal goblet. Lacey had expensive taste. She poured the thick ruby-red liquid out of the can and into the goblet. Synthetic blood to satiate vamps without harm to humans. Lacey was partial to the O-positive blend. Adam narrowed his eyes at her and then hopped up from the table. I'd love to stay and chat, Holly, but you know how I hate feeding time in the bat cave. Lacey bared her fangs at him, and he hustled from the room. his currently concealed tail between his legs. He loved to stir Lacey up, but often bailed before things got really ugly. Their all-out verbal brawls only happened about once a week. Everything else was tame in comparison. Thankfully. Otherwise, I'd have begged Harvey for a new residence a long time ago. I cringed at the reminder that Harvey was likely to pop up to ask questions with a murder in town. Harvey Culpepper was the agent assigned to me through the SPA and was responsible for keeping me safe and keeping others safe from me. Although most of the time that translated into needless babysitting. However, as they watched over all kinds of creatures, they tended to keep an eye on crimes reported within a certain radius of known supernaturals, which was probably a smart move. Unfortunately, with my potion business being a little, let's say, undocumented, a visit from SPA was the last thing I wanted. Batwings and broomsticks. Could this week get any worse? Already, we had a paranormal investigator sniffing around, a ghost on the edge of a breakdown, a vampire versus shifter battle brewing, a dead body, and a potential visit from Harvey. What else could go wrong? Chapter 9. With a free afternoon and a full mind, I did the only thing I knew to do that would help me unwind and clear my thoughts. I went to work in my garden. Behind the Beechwood Manor, there was an old potting shed that had been renovated into a greenhouse some time ago. When I moved in, I asked Posy if I could use it. She agreed that if I cleared out the cobwebs, it was all mine. A few afternoons and a little elbow grease later, still working on those magically propelled mops and brooms like in the movies, I had my own private gardening space to grow all the specialty herbs and plants needed for my potions. Over time, the greenhouse also became my sanctuary, a place to escape to when the world around me, or more likely my own roommates, got to be too much. Needless to say, I spent a lot of time in my garden. The morning rain had long since stopped, and the sun shone brightly overhead as Boots followed me out to the greenhouse. Once inside, he lolled about in the scattered fragments of sunshine that streamed in through the large windows and played across the ceramic-tiled floor. "It's a good day to be a cat, huh, Boots?" I asked him as I rolled up my sleeves. Despite the sun's appearance, there was still a lingering crispness in the air, but I knew I'd warm up once I started working. Boots stretched out further, arching his feline back into a half-moon. I left Boots to his basking and crossed the 10 by 12-foot space to the table along the far back wall. There were about a dozen copper planters lined up end to end under the windows that got partial sun. I ran my fingers over the sprouts and leaves one by one, as though each tender plant was one of my children. Considering that I'd raised them each from seeds, they sort of were. I talked to Boots as I checked the plants. "The coltsfoot looks strong. The dewdrops are getting tall. And oh, look at the nightshade. So beautiful. It's too bad we can't take them to the Seattle Haven, huh? That would be some nice mad money." I sighed, remembering the shortage that had been reported on the news the night I found Nick Rivers sneaking around the flower beds. Oh, well, we'll find our own customers. Boots meowed his agreement and rolled over to sun his other side. After my initial inventory, I started watering everything, and then went to trimming the first row of plants. When everything was done inside the greenhouse, I stepped back outside and went to tend to the containers where my outdoor plants were growing. My last chore was to weed through the raised beds that were in the middle of the backyard. I built them specifically for the plants that required full sun. A row of different mint varieties ran around the outside of the greenhouse, and while I worked in the raised bed, the scent of peppermint wafted over on the gentle afternoon breeze and tickled my nose. The smell immediately triggered the memory of being overwhelmed by the scent of peppermint right before looking around the dumpster and finding Peg's body. I shuddered. It was all so awful. As I gathered my watering can and filled it one final time, I wondered absently if Chief Lincoln was making any progress. How much experience did he have with homicides? If he had spent his entire career in a small town like Beechwood Harbor, it was hard to imagine that he'd ever worked a murder case before. As Cassie said, things like that didn't happen here. I sighed deeply and squeezed my eyes closed as the sunlight poured down on my face. Poor Peg. She would never feel the caress of the sun on her skin again. We'd never been terribly close, but she'd given me a job when my resume was spotty at best, and had never gone out of her way to cause me any real trouble. Then again, she was always busy riling other people up. It was something of a specialty for her. Kind of like Adam. I shook my head, dismissing him from my thoughts. Peg might have been unpleasant, but who would have despised her enough to cold cock her with a bottle of peppermint syrup and leave her for dead in the alley behind her own shop? It was just wrong. Had someone overheard her argument with Cassie and gone to Cassie's defense? Maybe things had gotten heated and the murder had been an accident. But who would go so far to defend Cassie against a handful of unproven accusations? It seemed far-fetched. There was no way of knowing what exactly had happened in that alley. It certainly wasn't up to me to figure it out. I had enough on my plate. All I wanted to do was keep my head down and not do anything that would risk losing my place at the Manor. Beechwood Harbor was starting to feel like it could be the home I'd longed for since leaving my childhood home, the San Francisco haven. For the first time in a while, I had friends. And even though Posey, Adam, and Lacey could drive me nuts, living with them gave me a sense of family that I'd missed since my parents passed away years ago. I went back to the greenhouse, shaking away the dark thoughts like tossing off a thick cloak, and lost myself in harvesting what I needed to restock my potion supplies. When my basket was full, I rounded up boots and headed back inside the Manor. I went to the kitchen and placed a magical lock on the door, freezing it in place. There was nothing that I despised more than being interrupted while I was working. I turned on some peppy music. I found it enhanced the potency of happiness potions, and sparked a fire under my green kettle on the stove. I figured I could get through a couple of batches before someone came knocking. Lacey was probably upstairs getting ready to go out for pageant practice. Adam was probably heckling her, and as far as I knew, Posey was still in town collecting gossip about Peg's murder. I hoped she would return with something helpful. As for Gary, the hulking mystery man who stayed in the room above mine, none of us were entirely sure what he was, but he appeared about as nocturnal as Lacey, and I couldn't remember ever seeing him in the kitchen. So, whatever he ate, it wasn't something we kept stocked. I shuddered to think of what that might imply. I hummed along with the familiar song, letting it carry me away from wondering what kinds of things were on Gary's menu, and went to work. I prepped all the fresh plant materials and then carefully combined the precisely measured ingredients to make a large batch of my specialty happiness potion, with my all-natural, organic herbs, of course. By the time dinner rolled around, I had 5 vials filled and ready for sale. I released the lock on the door and set about cleaning up my workspace. When the kitchen was spotless, I pocketed the potions and went out into the hallway, calling for Boots to follow me. As soon as the kitchen door swung shut behind me, a cold chill swept over me, and I froze in place, staring at the hunched shoulders straight ahead of me. "Oh! Hello, Gary?" The large man grunted, pulled the front door open, and stepped out into the dusky night, his feet dragging as though they were too heavy to properly lift. Right. He's not much of a talker. That was fine with me. He gave me the creeps. I hurried to my room, with Boots hot on my heels. Good, so it wasn't just me. After a fruitless attempt to find something to watch on TV, I gave up and decided to go for a walk around town. The sky was twinkling in that magical space right as the moon claims the sky and the sun dips out of sight over the ocean. It's my favorite time of day, the perfect time for a walk. Inevitably, I ended up passing by Siren's song. and was surprised to find a flock of people still standing behind the yellow police line. I shook my head and stepped forward to join those at the edge of the crowd to see what everyone was gawking at. The alley was cleared. Chief Lincoln and his team must have already processed everything and went back to the station to puzzle it out. I was mostly relieved to see that Peg's lifeless body had been removed. I wasn't sure I could have handled seeing it again.
Killed in cold blood.
I turned as I heard the voice of Mrs. Grady, a regular at the coffee shop. She was talking to Mrs. Brooks, another regular. From the looks of their fresh curls, they'd both just made a trek from the Lucky Lady Salon, the gossip well that supplied the whole town. Mrs. Brooks shook her head at her friend's assessment.
Just horrible. Poor Peg. Who would do such a thing?
If you ask me, he was probably that new hooligan I've seen wandering the neighborhood. I leaned in a little closer in order to hear their conversation, but kept my face turned away so my eavesdropping wasn't too obvious.
A hooligan?
Mrs. Brooks repeated, thoroughly scandalized at the notion.
Yes.
Mrs. Grady nodded emphatically.
Last night, I was out walking Dixie, and there was a strange man on the other side of the street. He was wearing one of those hooded sweatshirts, dark, like he was skulking around, trying to hide. But I saw him, and his jeans were hanging halfway down his keister.
I rolled my eyes. Mrs. Grady's tip was far from useful. Her description could apply to many of the young men that lived in or around Beechwood Harbor. It was a small town, but the prime waterfront access made it a popular spot for both tourists and those who lived inland in neighboring towns.
Dixie spotted him and all but dragged me back home again. I've never seen her run like that. There was something off about that man.
I thought about Gary. The handful of times that I'd seen him, he was dressed down, in holey jeans, sweatshirts, usually dark colors. And I never saw him during the day. It could have been Gary skulking around the neighborhood. He certainly had a spooky influence on Boots. Mrs. Grady's dog, Dixie, was a dappled dachshund who probably weighed less than Boots on a skinny day. Gary had moved into the manor a few months ago, and as far as I knew, neither Adam nor Lacey knew anything about him, or where he'd come from. He certainly wasn't a beachgoer, so what was he doing in a town like Beechwood Harbor? It didn't make sense. Was this the only place left for him to go? Had SPA sent him to the remote town to keep him out of trouble? A chill ran through me at the thought that he could be behind the murder. It was getting dark. Posy would likely be returning home soon if she wasn't already there. She didn't like to stay out after nightfall. I turned away from the small cluster of people at the police line. However, I only got a few feet when a voice called out to me. "Ollie!" Nick appeared at my side, and I bit back a groan. Was I ever going to get away from this guy? "Hello, Nick," I grumbled. Nick grinned at me. "Evening. You coming to see the chief?" I asked, tossing my chin in the direction of the abandoned crime scene. "Nope. I already have everything I need." "Oh, really?" I arched an eyebrow at him. "You doubt me?" I laughed. "Chief Lincoln is a tough guy to crack. I hardly think you just strolled up and got all of the case details." "Well, I didn't say that I got all the case details." Nick pocketed his hands in the front of his well-worn blue jeans. "But I got enough to work with." Another laugh burst forth. "Oh, okay. Well, good luck." I stepped to the side of him and made to move away. "Don't you want to know what I know?" I stopped and dragged my gaze back to him. "Not really. I trust that Chief Lincoln will solve the case and bring the murderer to justice." "Even if he thinks it's your friend Cassie?" My blood ran cold. Cassie was right. "He does not. That's absolutely ridiculous." My voice didn't sound nearly convincing enough. "I'm just telling you what I know. I've been here all day, and hers is the name that keeps coming up over and over again." "From the chief?" Nick nodded. "Batwings," I cursed under my breath. raking my fingers through my hair. Bat wings? Nick blinked. Oh no, he wasn't supposed to have heard that. It's an old family expression. His expression was doubtful. Okay. It was all happening just as Cassie had feared. And even with all of my power, there was nothing I could do to help her. Unless... I have to go find the chief. I looked up the road to where the police station was nestled between the fire department and a little sandwich shop. Holly, wait, Nick said, reaching for my arm. I whipped back, out of his reach, and a flare of magic tickled my palm. My heart was racing, and I knew I needed to be careful. Any time my emotions ran high, it was more likely that my magic could go haywire. I don't have time to wait, Nick. Cassie is my friend. I have to help her. Arguing with the police chief won't help anyone, he said, crossing his arms over his chest. Cassie didn't do this. Well, then it shouldn't be hard to prove. But right now, she's the only suspect on the list. I balled my hands into tight fists to contain myself. I can help you, Nick said. I flicked my gaze to him, and he flashed a smile. Why would you help me? Because if I help you, then you can help me. I wrinkled my nose, like I suddenly caught a whiff from a bag of expired toadstools. Seriously? My best friend is under investigation for murder and you're blackmailing me to get help? Blackmail? He reared back as though I'd struck him. No. But I'm a private investigator. I have a fee. I'm simply offering to waive the fee in exchange for something that I want. I glowered at him. You're repulsive. Come on, Holly. You let me run my tour of the manor, and I'll help you prove Cassie's innocence. I huffed and started down the sidewalk. Goodbye, Nick. Holly, wait. This is a business deal, cut and dried. I kept going. There was no point in trying with that man. I was a big girl with more power in my little finger, literally, than he could possibly imagine. I didn't need his help, or his back alley offer either. I would save Cassie's reputation all by myself. Chapter 10. I trudged all the way home, fuming that Nick had even tried to trick me into helping him with his lame tour. I swear, if he comes back to this house, I'm going to give him a real show, I muttered to myself as I pushed through the front door. Boots came running to greet me, and I stooped down to scratch under his chin. What do you think, Bootsy? A week tangled in some fishnet vines should do the trick. I laughed at the visual of Nick flailing to get free of the sticky, dark green vines that had a webbed growth pattern that resembled the stockings. Footsteps sounded on the main staircase. I glanced up, but kept my fingers running along Boots's chin. Adam was standing there, smirking at me. Talking to yourself, gorgeous? I frowned and gave Boots a pointed glance. I was talking to him, thank you very much. Adam laughed and came to stop a few feet in front of me, resting against the intricately carved banister at the base of the grand staircase. Well, if you need some human company, let me know. I rolled my eyes. Well, if there were any humans around here, he chuckled. You've had a rough day. Let me take you out for dinner. I promise to take your mind off all the drama. I sighed and pushed up from the floor. I straightened and gave Adam an exasperated glance. Are you ever off? What do you mean? Off? Ever since I moved in, you've been after me for a date. It's been 6 months, Adam. At what point do you start picking up on the clues I'm dropping that say I'm not interested? I mean, honestly, they could fill the bed of a dump truck by now. Adam laughed and folded his arms. I'm a persistent man/beast. I smiled despite myself. Adam was all kinds of charming, which made it impossible to ignore him completely. I think you should move on to other targets, I said, my tone light and matter-of-fact. I wasn't mad at Adam for his persistent nature. Most of the time I found it flattering, but today my mind was too occupied elsewhere to give him proper banter in return, which was a shame, because it was usually a lot of fun. Nah, I've still got more tricks up my sleeve. Adam grinned at me, then dropped his hands and shoved them into the front pockets of his worn jeans. In any case, I do need to go rustle up something for dinner. You're welcome to come along. No strings. I eyed him, and then arched a brow. Is it coming from the pickup window or the dumpster? Adam laughed and shook his head. Come on, Holly. Let's go. I glanced at Boots, wishing he could tell me what to do. I trusted his sense of judgment more than my own sometimes. He blinked once. All right, I said, meeting Adam's dark eyes. But first, have you seen Posey? I have something I need to ask her about. She's in the study. I'll go get gussied up, he said, batting his eyes and miming like he had long, luxurious locks to fluff and primp, before jogging back up the stairs. Okay, Lacey, I teased. I was still laughing to myself as I went down the hall past my room and opened the heavy wooden door to the study. Posey? I called softly, peering around the door.
Over here.
Her glum voice came from near the unlit fireplace. I entered the room on the balls of my feet. Posey was sitting in, strategically floating above, one of the two wingback chairs angled to frame the fireplace. They were upholstered in maroon crushed velvet and lent a gothic chic flavor to the formal room. It was filled with dark wood furniture, stained glass windows, and the scent of old books. What are you doing in here all alone? I asked, taking the seat opposite her. I smoothed my hands over the thighs of my dark jeans.
I needed some peace and quiet,
she replied, shifting her gaze to me in slow motion. Is everything all right? It was incredibly important that the answer was yes, for all of our sakes. She dragged her eyes back to the empty, cold fireplace.
Yes, I just feel deflated after hearing about the murder.
Everyone is still gathered outside the alley.
Yes, I saw that on my way back here. It's so tragic.
Did you learn anything about who might have done it? Posey leveled her stare at me.
Mostly people were talking about the argument Peg had with that friend of yours.
A flicker of fear ran through me. Oh.
She seems like a nice girl, though, Posey added, absently. Did you need something, Holly? I think I might go up to the attic.
I wiped the sweat from my palms on the denim, and then folded them in my lap. If you have a minute, I did have a couple of questions. About Gary.
Gary?
She glanced back over at me, her thick eyebrows rising above her dark-rimmed spectacles.
What about him? He's not causing trouble, is he?
I shook my head. No. Well, at least not that I know of.
I'm afraid I'm not following.
I blew out a puff of air. How does it work when new tenants move into the Beechwood Manor? I was moved here by my SPA agent, Harvey. I didn't have to fill out paperwork or anything. I'm just curious how you get new tenants, like Gary. Where do we all come from?
Oh, well, I have an arrangement with SPA. They keep the manor's deed and handle the legal side of things for me. In exchange for that, I provide 4 rooms for rent. Whenever there is a vacancy, they seek to fill it with paranormals like yourself, who have trouble fitting in within the Haven system.
I gave a small nod. Trouble fitting in with the Haven system? That was certainly one way of putting it. I pressed on, knowing my window was closing. Posey wanted to leave, and Adam was waiting for me. I drew in a breath and cut right to the quick. Okay, so when Gary came here, were you aware of the kind of trouble he was having?
Not really.
Posey shook her head.
I don't require much information as long as they pay their rent to keep the house running and the taxes paid, and they keep to themselves. I don't need to know the specifics of what led them here.
I sighed. But Posey, what if someone dangerous moved in? Posey's gaze sharpened to a hawk-like expression.
You think Gary is dangerous?
I hesitated. It was a heavy accusation to go slinging around with virtually no proof. All I had to go on was a gut feeling that could only be described as the heebie-jeebies, a cat who bolted on sight as though a firecracker went off in the next room, and the word of two elderly ladies who were mainly basing their opinion off of saggy pants and a nervous wiener dog. I lived in the Haven system almost my entire life. I know that most supers are just trying to find a place to belong, somewhere where they won't be judged for their abilities, gifts, or curse. But there's a small pocket of supers that do bad things. Really bad things. I think it's disconcerting that just about any paranormal could move into the Beechwood Manor, especially if the only criteria is that they couldn't stay in a haven. Posey stared at me, as though she couldn't decide whether to be offended or frightened. As a ghost, there were few things that had the power to do damage to her. That's why her concern was for the Beechwood Manor itself. The home was her anchor to this world. Without it, there was no telling where she'd end up. However, as a witch, there were a lot of creatures that scared me. I'd encountered enough of them to know I needed to be on my guard. And there was something about Gary that rattled me. At first, I'd told myself it was simply because I couldn't identify him, but now, after hearing what Mrs. Grady had said, and thinking about the fact that he could be linked to Peg Holloway's murder, a series of alerts inside my mind were flashing and screaming for me to get to the bottom of it sooner rather than later.
I don't know what you expect me to do, Holly. If you want Gary removed from the house, I'm afraid you have to take that up with SPA.
I nodded, inwardly groaning at the prospect. Well, what do you know of him? I've barely seen him more than a handful of times, and I don't think he's ever said anything more than 3 or 4 words. Do you know what he is? Posey glanced from side to side, as though worried we might be overheard. The study door was shut, and I hadn't seen anyone else wandering around besides Adam. But maybe Posey's ghost senses were telling her to be on guard. I wasn't sure how the whole ghost thing worked.
I think he's a gargoyle.
A gargoyle? I repeated it with a mystified exhale. I couldn't remember meeting a gargoyle before. But they were reclusive creatures who tended to keep odd hours, preferring the cover of darkness. Check, check, and check. Gary the gargoyle.
Have you met one before?
Posey asked. I shook my head. I don't think so. Have you? She hesitated, but then nodded.
There was one here a few years ago. He was from the New York Haven, and I think he was on the run from the mob. It was a particularly busy summer, and I was tied up with a warring pair of vampires. How SPA managed to send me a vampire from the Mulder family and the Tenor house at the same time?
I winced at the idea. The Mulder and Tenor houses had been at war before my great-grandmother was even born. How on earth did SPA bungle that? Posey threw her hands in the air.
I have no idea. Anyway, to say I was a little busy would be an understatement. The gargoyle, Kent, or was it Kenneth? No matter. He didn't stay long, and when he disappeared, I called SPA to complain that he hadn't paid his rent before he left, and they told me they had no record of him. I think they were just trying to cover their mistakes.
Comforting. Do you think he was dangerous? Posey considered me for a long moment.
There were rumors.
I held my breath.
A girl, a tourist, here on vacation with her family, went missing, and the next day is when he vanished.
I pressed a hand to cover my gaping mouth. That's awful. Posey nodded sadly at the memory. She dropped her eyes to her hands, and I got the feeling that if she had functioning tear ducts, they would have filled.
I've become more stringent with making sure the supers who check in match their ID from SPA. Other than that, I don't ask too many questions. Now, Gary's been here for 2 months, and so far there haven't been any complaints.
Can I see his ID? Posey narrowed her gaze.
Out of the question. Now I've told you all I know. I'm going to retire to the attic.
Posey, I didn't mean to— The rest of my words faded as she slipped through the unlit fireplace. I scoffed to myself in the empty room. Less than helpful. I didn't want to call Harvey and see what he could dig up, but it was quickly becoming my only option. The door of the study popped open, and Adam sauntered into the room wearing a smugly victorious grin.
You ready for dinner, gorgeous?
Oh, that's right. Before I could launch into the investigation, I had a non-date date with a shifter. Perfect. Chapter 11.
This is nice, huh?
I smiled up at Adam as we strolled down the street, each of us working our way through an ice cream cone from Sprinkles and Splits, an old-fashioned soda fountain on the corner of 4th and Zinnia, right in the heart of Beechwood Harbor. As much as I hated to admit it, we were having a good time together. He'd taken me to McNally's, through the front doors, not down the alley, and after a nice dinner, we decided to walk off the onion rings and beer-battered cod. We ended up standing in front of the local ice cream shop right before they shut down for the night. One thing led to another, and we found out that we both have a weakness for mint chocolate chip and waffle cones. I have to say, it is pretty nice. Adam grinned. I mostly meant the ice cream, I added, holding my cone up. Adam snorted, but didn't try to argue with me.
Fair enough. Mr. Harris makes the best cones I've ever had.
I swallowed another mouthful of the frosty treat, lingering over the smooth mint and the way the rich, dark chocolate chips melted on my tongue. How long have you lived in Beechwood Harbor?
About 3 years,
he replied casually. He took a bite out of his cone and then shifted his attention back to me.
I was in the Boston Haven before moving up here.
Why did you leave the Havens? Adam took another bite.
The shifters in Boston were on the verge of a turf war. I got out before it got too carried away, but I decided I didn't want to go through all the work of finding a new crew. I decided that I'm more of a lone wolf. Well, dog, I guess.
Well, not that much of a loner, apparently. You did end up in a house full of supernaturals.
I guess that's true.
Adam chuckled.
The location of the manor is nice. I have a lot of space to run around, and if anyone sees me in my beast form, they just figure they saw a wolf. As long as I stay out of the way, I can live a normal life here.
Well, as normal as you can, considering that you spend most of your days arguing with a wannabe beauty queen vampiress. Adam dropped his head back and roared with laughter.
Seriously, what the heck is all that about anyway? I keep thinking she's going to give it up, that one day she's going to realize how insane she sounds and stop going on about it, but so far?
Yeah. I overheard her singing practice the other day from the hall outside her bathroom. I cringed at the memory of the screechy rendition of a song made famous by Petra, the witch pop star. Let's just say it's a good thing she's going to ace the bikini portion of the pageant because the talent is lacking. Adam pulled a face.
I can't decide if I want her to win or lose.
I smiled. You know what I think? I think you like her.
Why would you think that? You just said it yourself. We're at each other's throats. Sometimes literally, 90% of the time.
It's classic boy meets girl. You tease her because you like her. I swallowed down another smooth bite from my cone and licked the sugary coating from my lips. Adam grinned at me, shaking his head.
You're way off base on this one, Holly.
I shrugged.
We'll see. Let me ask you something,
Adam said, still grinning at me.
What would I be doing here with you on a—
I held up a finger, interrupting him. It's not a date. He chuckled.
My question still stands.
I don't know. I think you like the chase. I tossed my long hair over my shoulder and popped the last bite of cone into my mouth. Adam nodded.
So considering you're here with me, does that mean I've caught you?
I stopped walking, something across the street catching my eye. Adam sighed.
Holly, I was just—
Wait. I held up my hand to stop him. My mind was racing in an entirely new direction, and our previous conversation fell to the wayside. I hadn't realized where we'd been walking, but now, from across the street, I could see the dark outline of Siren's song. "Oh, the tape's still up," Adam said, stopping at my side. "They must still be working on the case. That's gotta be a good sign for Cassie. If they had enough to arrest her, they would have taken all this down." "That's probably true." I started to turn away when an idea sparked. I slid my gaze over to Adam. "But they're gone for the night." "Looks like it." Without another word, I started jogging across the deserted street. "Holly!" Adam hissed after me. I stopped at the police tape and stared down the alley. "Holly, what are you doing?" Adam said, catching up to me. What was I doing? I couldn't cross the line and risk getting tangled up with Chief Lincoln or anyone else in the Beechwood Harbor PD. But I had to find out what had really happened. If it was Gary, I needed to know, so that I could protect myself and my roommates. That would also clear Cassie. Surely, if there was a paranormal element in play, Adam and I could sniff it out. A normal cop might not see something that would stand out to one of us. I hadn't filled him in on my theory about Gary, or my conversation with Posey and the possibility that Gary was a gargoyle. I wasn't sure what he would think. Adam had probably met far more dangerous creatures than me, especially if he was from the Boston Haven. A big city like that was undoubtedly full of all kinds of interesting supers with varying backgrounds. I turned to face Adam. His dark eyes were wide, and a faint amber glow was ringing his pupils. He was ready to shift. "I have to find out what happened, Adam." "I don't think this is a good idea." His voice was low, almost a growl. "Then you stay here and keep watch. I'm just going to take a quick look and I'll be right back." Adam grabbed my arm. "Are you sure about this?" I considered him, and then looked back over the police line. "I have to see what I can find out. For Cassie." "All right, but let's hurry." Adam nodded and pulled up the yellow tape. "Ladies first." I laughed softly. So chivalrous, considering the circumstance. One shouldn't lose their manners, even when breaking and entering. Don't forget trespassing and tampering with a crime scene. I smiled and slipped under the line. He groaned. "Perfect. Just how I like to end all of my non-date dates." "Come on." I scuttled down the alley, light on my feet, and once I was out of view of the street, I conjured an orb of light. I held up my palm and spread the fragments of light from the glowing ball to give us a better look at the dark alley. It looked more or less the same as it had that morning when I'd appeared on the other side of the dumpster. With my free hand, I ran my fingers over the locket resting against my chest. It didn't hold a protection charm, but it made me feel safer all the same. Adam was right at my side, taking the same care with his footsteps. I'd never seen him so cautious before. He was normally more of a bull in a china shop kind of guy. He sniffed the air. "Still smells like peppermint." I nodded, smelling the traces of the pungent scent. "Hey, if you were in your beast form, your senses would be even higher, right?" Adam nodded. "I suppose. But I'd probably doggy barf all over with this damn peppermint stench." "Yeah, but you might be able to get past that and get us a clue." He frowned, looking doubtful. I tugged on his sleeve. "Come on, Adam." All right. Don't get your broomstick in a knot." I wrinkled my nose. My broomstick in a knot? What is that even supposed to mean? He chuckled. "I don't know. I was improvising." "Hang tight, gorgeous." He pulled his shirt off, and I swallowed hard, forgetting that he would need to strip down before changing. I'd seen Adam in beast form on multiple occasions, but had never been around when he was actually changing. I'm going to go inside. You see what you can find out here." Adam chuckled at my shaky tone. I launched myself at the back door when I heard him start removing his jeans. I unlocked the door, pushed inside, and quickly closed it behind me. Phew! I flicked my wrist and sent the orb of light overhead to flood the space with light. I didn't want to risk turning on the overhead lights. The front of the shop was almost entirely made of windows, so if I flicked on the lights, I would risk having some pedestrian call the cops and report the crime scene was being tampered with. Which, to be fair, it was. With my own orb of light, I could control it, and keep it much lower, and point it at only the things I wanted to look at, and extinguish it in a snap, literally, if someone wandered by. I glanced around the space, trying to decide where to go first. The dark laminate floors, made to look like cherry wood, were clean and polished, despite the day of heavy foot traffic. Straight ahead, the door to Peg's office was open, and I decided it was a good place to start. With a tugging gesture, the orb of light followed behind me, providing just enough light to see the ground in front of me. Once I was inside Peg's office, I gave the orb more power, and the entire room was filled with light. No one could see the office from the outside of the building, as it was basically an oversized supply closet that was converted into an office. It was clear that the forensic team had been through the space. Papers and folders were ruffled and out of order, and 2 desk drawers were still pulled open a few inches. Peg was a meticulous lady who would have never left her office in such a mess. The stack of papers on the desk was fanned out, and I glanced through them one at a time, still not sure what I was looking for. But when I found a thick bundle of pages held together with a black paperclip, with a post-it on the front labeled Urgent, I stopped. I picked the papers up and flipped through each one. It appeared to be some kind of contract regarding Siren's song. Had Peg been trying to sell the coffee shop? I hadn't heard anything about it, but that didn't mean it wasn't happening. I'd only been an employee for a handful of months, so I definitely wasn't on her list of confidants. I didn't even think she liked me all that much. Then again, Peg had never been overly friendly with anyone, so I didn't feel alone in that camp. I got to the last page of the contracts, past all the legal mumbo-jumbo that most humans didn't understand, let alone a witch who was raised in a completely different kind of society, one where people didn't sue each other over spilled hot coffee or potholes in the road, and sucked in a small breath as I realized what the papers were all about. A man named Philip Tanner was suing Peg for half of Siren's song, or at least half of the money it had generated over the last 5 years. What in the world? I read the details again, committing them to memory. Batwings! This is major! I set the pages back where I found them and rifled through the rest of the papers. Nothing stood out. Everything else was either a receipt for an order, a spreadsheet page from past month's sales, or payroll details. I found a page with Cassie's clocked hours, with Peg's chicken scratch writing in the margins. She must have been tracking Cassie's hours and the discrepancies from the till to see if there was crossover. I grimaced, hoping that she had been wrong about Cassie. I knew that Cassie hadn't murdered Peg. But the issue with the missing till money was a different issue altogether. I couldn't imagine Cassie stealing from the till, but at the same time, she made minimum wage and relied on tips to get her through. With her current family situation and the financial hardship they were under, it wasn't that out of the question that she might have done something rash under the terrible pressure. Peg continually refused to give her a promotion. Maybe she had decided to take matters into her own hands and skim a little off the top. I shook my head, banishing the thought. Hot guilt ran over me as I realized how far I'd fallen down the rabbit hole. I knew better. No, there was no way that Cassie stole the money, and she definitely did not kill Peg. But then who did? This Philip Tanner? What was the connection there? I picked up the contracts again. They were calling to me for some reason. I was halfway through a second pass when a loud bang sounded from the alley. I jumped, and my hand brought up a stunning spell, ready to fire at whatever the source of the noise was. Outside, it sounded as though something large crashed into the metal dumpsters. Then my spine went ramrod straight at a low, guttural growl. Adam. Chapter 12. Adam? I bolted back through the shop, nearly slipping on the slick floors, and crashed into a solid form. Ollie? A flashlight beam hit me in the face and temporarily blinded me. Nick? I blinked the fuzzy spots from my view and backed up a step. When my eyes could focus again, I narrowed them at the dark outline in front of me. Batwings! Nick, what are you doing here? Nick's flashlight illuminated the space between us. What are you doing here? This is a crime scene, Holly. You might have noticed the tape out front. I crossed my arms. Uh-huh. And where's your badge, Mr. Rivers? He grimaced. Fine. You're here, I'm here. We might as well work together. Afterward, I'll walk you home. There's a massive stray on the loose out there. I bristled at his commanding tone. He's not a stray. His name is Adam. You have a dog? He glanced over his shoulder back into the alley. Batwings. I pressed my eyes closed and wished I'd stayed home. No! I mean, he's not my dog, but I know of him. Yeesh. This was going to be complicated if Nick and Adam ever met when Adam was not a dog. Sometimes being supernatural was a real pain in the tush. Nick stepped inside and I backed up to make room. The door closed softly behind him. Well, I scared him off for now, but I'll still walk you home when this is done. I blinked. And by this, you mean... He circled the flashlight around the room. Investigating. I thought you already knew everything? I arched a skeptical brow at him. Nick smiled. I came up with some new questions. So come on, Holly. Let's compare notes. What have you found so far? Why do you even care, Nick? You didn't even know Peg. I get that you're a PI, but what's in it for you? Did someone hire you to investigate this case? Nick considered me for a long moment. The truth? That would be preferable. Although I could whip up a truth-be-told potion if the occasion called for it. Nick heaved a sigh. All right. The truth is, I'm new in town and looking to establish my own business here. No one's hired me to take the case, but I'm hoping that if I can get in good with Chief Lincoln and his officers, that maybe they will hire me as a consultant, or even send business my way. You know, the things that fall outside their scope but still need someone to look into. And the paranormal tours are what, then? A side gig? Nick shrugged and started looking around the back room. Something like that. More of a personal hobby that brings in a little cash when the chips are down. Uh-huh. I nodded and shifted my weight back into my heels. I glanced past Nick, out the open door, and wondered where Adam had gone. I halfway expected him to come through the back door, sloppily dressed, wearing a mischievous grin that would make Nick wonder what I'd really been doing. What's in it for me? I asked, dragging my eyes back to Nick. He rounded back to face me, guiding his light beam off a pile of cardboard boxes stacked against the back wall. He smiled in a way that made me think he would have puffed out his chest and straightened his bow tie if he'd been wearing one. You get me. Gee, what a prize. His smile dialed back a smidgen. I'll help you solve the case and prove that it wasn't your friend Cassie. I sighed. That was the one thing he could pull. Without the tour? He frowned, but then inclined his head. One night, then I'll never come back to the manor. I studied his eyes for a moment. Cassie needed my help. I could figure out the tour later. All right, fine. What do you know? Nick flashed a triumphant grin and held out his hand to seal the deal. My fingers twitched, aching to hex him. Instead, I swallowed hard and set aside the havoc that would come my way once Posey found out that for one night she was going to be hosting a spookathon. It was almost comical. Except it wasn't. Adam and Lacey were going to kill me. One night, Nick. That's all I'm giving you. He chuckled, and I ground my teeth at the double meaning of my statement. You know what I mean. He got it together long enough to answer, Yup. One night at your place, Holly. He all but wiggled his eyebrows at me. I huffed and started to push past him for the door. I'd had enough. Come on, he said, his laughter dying off. He snagged my arm and reeled me back in. I balled my hands into tight fists and planted them on my hips. Spill what you know, or I'm out of here, and I'll spend the next 6 months making your life so miserable that you'll fly out of town fast enough to make the street signs spin around in your wake. He blinked hard at my threat. Apparently, I could be scary even without magic flinging from my hands. Good to know. With what I'd gathered about Nick, it likely wasn't the last time I would need to shake him up. He held up his hands. Okay, you win. The forensics team found a pair of shoes in the dumpster 2 doors down from here. They were coated in peppermint syrup. Nick tiptoed away and started poking around again. And of course that was the murder weapon. I grimaced. I still can't believe someone really smashed one of those bottles into Peg's head hard enough to kill her. Yup. Pretty gruesome way to go, if you ask me. I shuddered. Not to mention smelly. Nick stifled a laugh and started toward Peg's office. I gasped, suddenly remembering that my magic orb of light was still hanging inside. Nick turned back at my gasp. What? Did you see something? No. But I remembered that yesterday, Peg got a phone call before I left for the day. She wrote some notes on the pad we keep by the phone. Maybe that has something to do with it. Let's go look. Nick took off down the short hall, heading for the front of the shop. I found it funny that he was set on leading the way when I was the one who had worked in the shop for 4 months. Whatever. It worked. I hung back as he disappeared around the corner and then bolted back to snap my fingers at the orb. The light vanished in a soft poof, and I heaved a sigh of relief. That would have been hard to explain away. I really need to work on my memory charms, I reminded myself as I jogged to catch up with Nick. When I rounded the corner, he was standing at the cordless phone base. This pad? He gestured with the tip of his finger, careful not to touch the neon blue pad that was shaped like a coffee cup. Yep. I peered over his shoulder and caught a whiff of his cologne. Oh, thank the stars, I can smell again. Nick frowned and glanced over at me. What? After the peppermint exposure, I haven't been able to smell anything but mint all day, but I can smell your cologne. Nick flashed a grin. Oh yeah? You like it? It's new. His face was inches from mine, and with the flashlight providing the only light, it was a little too cozy. I took a step back and put the proper amount of space between us. Yeah, it's fantastic. I rolled my eyes. I pointed at the pad. Anyway, yes, that's the pad I was talking about. Although it looks like she took the note when she left. Bats! What's the deal with you and bats? You're not a vampire or something, are you? Nick laughed at his own suggestion, and I bristled, highly offended. No, I was most certainly not a vampiress. Thank the stars. Nick elbowed me. Come on, Holly. Laugh, smile, something. I was just teasing you. I flashed a sarcastic smile. Happy? He groaned. I put my fists back on my hips and scanned the softly lit room. The chairs were all stacked on the tables, left there from when Cassie and Frankie, a part-timer, would have gone through and cleaned up. It looked so different at night. Outside, the patio glowed with solar-powered lanterns. As I stared out into the quiet night, the exhaustion of the day caught up with me. I gestured at the counter. Well, the notepad's a bust. Not necessarily, he said, slipping back into PI mode. He fished in his jacket and retrieved a plastic bag. I have all my forensic stuff in the car. I have this sand stuff that can fill in what was on the note by using the indents from the pen when she wrote it. Most people push hard enough to leave marks on the page beneath. The sand will show us what she wrote down. That's fantastic. A genuine smile spread across my face. Nick returned my smile and nodded. It might help. What else should we search? He slipped the pad into the bag and pocketed it in his jacket. Were you in the office? I nodded. Yeah, I didn't find much. Well, I gave him a sidelong glance. Ollie, we're partners now, remember? I sighed. Okay, come on. I led him to the office and showed him the contracts I found earlier. Nick pored over them page by page, his expression getting more grim with each new chunk of text. "This is bad." I nodded, and tucked a strand of hair back behind my ear. "Yeah, I thought so too. The investigators didn't say anything about this?" Nick shook his head, and set the papers down once he'd tapped them back into an orderly stack against the desk. "No. To be honest with you, once they found those shoes, Chief Lincoln went back to the station and the crew shut this place down." My brow furrowed. "I don't understand. Why would the shoes crack the case?" "They were coated in the syrup, like someone was standing beneath a shower of that vile peppermint stuff. The murderer obviously used a weapon of convenience, the bottle, and in the process they would have ended up covered in that stuff. So think about it. If they were your shoes, would you wear them into your car? Or would you dump them?" He had a point. How do they know they were thrown away today? Maybe it was from a while ago. Those dumpsters only get emptied every other week. Bottles get broken from time to time. Things spill. A coffee shop isn't a clean environment. It was fresh, Holly. And once they found out about the argument with Cassie, they kind of called it a day. I wrinkled my nose. I'm still not following. Nick flashed me a pitying look. "Holly, the shoes. They were Cassie's." "How do they know who they belong to?" "Frankie Jensen ID'd them as the ones she'd been wearing the night before." I sucked in a sharp breath and covered my mouth. Oh no.